From the very beginning stages of development for WoW, Blizzard knew they wanted flying to be a primary way players moved about long distances in the world. The system they eventually settled on for flying involved selecting flight masters and flight paths. The players then had no control over their character as they were whisked away across the skies in Azeroth to their selected destinations. This made the world feel both massive and complex, and was a wholly unique experience for its time. In fact, WoW essentially pioneered this mode of transportation of unlocking waypoints through flight paths and flight masters. Most players have few options to travel around the world, and this was especially true when WoW launched in 2004. Of course, Blizzard wanted to retain players' interest during these flights, and they were very well aware flying could be long and boring. So they decided to put interesting things for players to see along various flight routes in vanilla. One example of this is the Dwarven airfield outside Ironforge. Another example of this is the network of tunnels bridging wetlands in Dun Morogh. Could only be seen on scripted flight paths as well. In fact, flight routes were specifically designed around flight routes with the player's view in mind. The players wanted players to have the illusion of a massive open world that could be viewed in 360 degrees as the player flew across a zone on a predetermined flight path. Blizzard knew their game had great technical and graphical constraints, and made sure the players could only fly from one flight path to another on this specific route and nothing more. Allowing players to freely fly wherever they please would immediately ruin immersion, since early WoW was nothing but 2D textures covering up and hiding holes in maps and invisible walls, which stopped players from falling off the map. Flight masters and flight paths were also much more spread out and sparse in Kalimdor and the Eastern Kingdoms in vanilla. In vanilla, the Alliance had 31 flight points, 14 in Kalimdor and 16 in the Eastern Kingdoms. In vanilla, the Horde had 29 flight points, 17 in Kalimdor and 12 in the Eastern Kingdoms. Of course, this isn't taking into account various other means of transportation such as zeppelins, the Deep Ran Tram, or the two boats that sail back and forth between the continents. But a total of 31 flight points for Alliance and 29 flight points for Horde in vanilla clearly shows how much bigger and vast the world was to explore in vanilla. With flying being an integral part of the game since its inception, it has become so entangled in gameplay that it's often easy to overlook. One interesting final note is that prior to 1.12, the riding skill worked as an ability rather than a profession. Using this as a starting point, we'll discuss the development of how flying has evolved over the first 9 expansions of World of Warcraft. The first time players could fly on their own mounts was in Outland with the launch of the Burning Crusade expansion. Allowing players to fly in Outland made sense both in terms of lore and for gameplay reasons. Lore-wise, Outlands is essentially a bunch of rocks floating in space. It's hard to ride ground mounts where there is no ground. In regards to gameplay, only limiting movement to the ground would make a lot of gameplay much longer, especially since a lot of Outland zones are so linear in nature. It takes over 15 minutes to get from Tempest Keep to the Black Temple by flying using a flight path. Imagine how long it would take without flying and having to account for all the verticality and various patrolling mobs as well. Adding verticality to zones also meant Blizzard could add specific areas with content which could only be accessible by max level players. The most well-known of these would be the Netherwing Drakes in the Shadowmoon Valley. Flying definitely helped in getting to the Ogrilla and the Blade's Edge Mountains, but it wasn't absolutely necessary to get to the Enlightened Ogres by flying to them. Upon reaching level 70 in the Burning Crusade, players could learn flying from the riding trainers. This was started by receiving a quest from Natrul, the flight master in Shattrath. To learn the flying skill, Alliance players could visit Osla Brusbrew in the Wildhammer Stronghold in Shadowmoon Valley, and Horde players could visit Olrock, an orc who was also located in Shadowmoon Village, which is also in Shadowmoon Valley. Both of these NPCs sold 2 different levels of flying, Expert Riding and Artisan Riding. Expert Riding allowed the player to ride rare mounts at 60% movement speed on both land and in the air for 800 gold. It is important to note that even though players could fly in air with an Expert Riding, it was still far faster to travel around using Flight Masters, since Flight Masters provided a 100% increased movement speed, and rare mounts only gave a 60% speed. Artisan Riding allowed the players to ride at 100% movement speed on land and 280% speed while in the air for 5,000 gold. However, that was not all the gold the player needed to spend, since they also needed to buy the flying mounts themselves. Luckily, these mounts were not too expensive, and a rare mount cost 100 gold with an epic mount requiring 200 gold. Players also had to have previously bought both the Apprentice and Journeyman riding skills before they could buy the Expert riding skills. Flying mounts were mostly limited to Griffins for the Alliance and Wyverns for the Horde and TBC. By the end of the Burning Crusade, there were a total of 24 flying mounts, but those 6 mounts that players could buy were by far the only ones most players had. Other mounts came from raid drops, PvP gladiator mounts, and the engineering profession, to name a few. Since the Burning Crusade was designed with flying in mind, players were free to roam the skies of Outland. However, players could still not fly with their own mounts on Azeroth in the Burning Crusade. This was because of some of the technical limitations mentioned earlier, and this no-flying policy was expanded to both the Draenei and Blood Elf starting zones for another few reasons as well. The new Azeroth zones in the TBC were on an entirely different server from the original vanilla servers, and no flying also kept the immersion of a new player's or character's experience, discouraging ganking in PvP and kept all of Azeroth's skies closed to the players. The expansion Wrath of the Lich King saw a few changes to flying. First off, the mount cast time was reduced in half from 3 seconds to 1.5 seconds in patch 3.2. Second, the expert riding skill was also reduced to 250 gold in the same patch. Wrath of the Lich King also saw the next level of flying implemented. Upon reaching level 77, players could learn cold weather flying for 1000 gold. Interestingly, there is a cold weather flying trainer in almost every zone in Northrend, with the exception of Howling Fjord, Dragonblight, and Icecrown. In total, 5 cold weather flying trainers can be found in Northrend, with 3 being neutral and 1 faction-specific trainer in the Borean Tundra. In patch 3.2, 2 more flying trainers were added, but this time in the Hellfire Peninsula and Outland. Hargan Bronzeweed was added to Honored Hold, and Jahubo was added to Thrallmar. This was the first time in the game that a player could learn flying without being at max level. At the max level of 80, a player could buy a Tome of Cold Weather Flying for 1000 gold and could mail it to any of their alts to use. They all could then learn Cold Weather Flying from the tome so long as they were level 68 or higher and had the Artisan Riding skill. These tomes could be bought from any Cold Weather Flying trainer. Several vendors who sold flying mounts were also added in Wrath of the Lich King. Notably among these vendors were My Francis and Dalaran, and the flying trainer Roxy Ramrock getting K3 in the Storm Peaks. The third and final major change to flying in Wrath was that Blizzard tried to push mounted combat hard in this expansion, to little success. While there was very minimal mounted flying combat, Blizzard did try to push it a little bit too far. There is a reason the Nexus dungeon was so often immediately deserted, and who else could forget the lovely flying disc phase of the Malagos encounter. Needless to say, the flying combat feature was not very well received in the community, and Blizzard eventually gave up on it. Although it has cropped up in scenarios and quests every now and then since Wrath, mounted flying combat has been much more of a rarity than the norm. Finally, we should briefly mention that it seems dragon riding from the Dragonflight expansion may have taken some inspirations and ideas from the mounted flying combat system in Wrath. Let's hope Blizzard learns their lesson so that dragon riding is fun and not a painful experience. Wrath of the Lich King also added achievements to the game. Among these were 4 achievements for when the player learned a new level of riding or flying. The first achievement is Giddy Up, and is earned when the player learns the Apprentice Riding skill, which gives the player riding skill of level 75. The next achievement is named Fast and Furious, and was given when the player learns a Journeyman Riding skill. This is presumably a reference to the movie franchise of the same name. The Journeyman Riding skill raises the player's riding skill to a level of 125. When players learn Expert Riding skill, and they have their riding skill increased to 225, they earn the achievement Into the Wild Blue Yonder, which is most likely a reference to the unofficial name for the official song of the United States Air Force. Expert Riding is when a player first unlocks flying mounts and can use them at 150% speed. The final flying achievement is The Right Stuff, and is earned when players learn the Artisan Riding skill and gain a riding skill of 300. This achievement's name is a reference to the 1979 book of the same name by Tom Wolfe. Next, we move on to the Cataclysm expansion. Cataclysm saw the old world completely redesigned and updated, and with these massive changes, Blizzard could update the game's graphics and assets to allow players to be able to fly in the old world without breaking the game or the player's immersion. To be able to fly in the newly revamped Kalimdor, Eastern Kingdoms, and the Elemental Plane of the Deepholm, players had to buy a Flight Master's license for 250 gold. The license had to be learned after the players bought the Master Riding skill for 5,000 gold. As of patch 4.03, almost all riding trainers offered the Master Riding skill, which increased the player's riding skill to 375 and provided flying mounts with a 310 increased speed boost while in the air. Upon learning the Master Riding skill, players earned the achievement Breaking the Sound Barrier. Flying was available at level 80, and the maximum level during Cataclysm was 85. This led to some controversy, as it allowed players at max level to easily fly and do content in the 5 new zones at Deepholm, Mount Hyjal, Twilight Highlands, Uldum, and Vashir, without being max level and having level through all these questing contents first. From a technical perspective, it makes sense that flying would be unlocked for both continents as a whole, since they're on a huge server and almost all the new Cataclysm zones themselves are on Kalimdor and the Eastern Kingdoms. However, Blizzard did listen to feedback, and Cataclysm remains the only expansion which allowed players to be able to immediately fly when it first launched. Of course, even today, WoW servers cannot fit all of the zones into the game onto one map, so it's no surprise some smaller zones in Cataclysm, such as Tol Barad, were limited to ground mounts. This makes sense from both a gameplay and logistics sense. A small island could easily be flown around in, and the map would feel so much smaller. Additionally, of course, Tol Barad was a mostly PvP zone, and seeing your opponent fly away during an open world battleground would not be the best feeling in the world. Finally, Tol Barad has to be phased for the battleground and reset daily for quests, both of which are hard to do in a massive open world and would break WoW's technical limitations. Another prominent example of a smaller no-fly zone from Cataclysm is the Molten Front Offensive in the Fireland. In Cataclysm, the number of flight points and flight paths increased drastically with the updates to the old world. For some numbers, the number of Alliance flight paths in Kalimdor went from 14 in Vanilla to 52 in Cataclysm, and the number of Alliance flight points in the Eastern Kingdoms went up from 16 to 69. The number of Horde flight points in Kalimdor went from 17 in Vanilla to 58 in Cataclysm, and the number of Horde flight points in Eastern Kingdoms changed from 12 to 64. It should be noted, some of these flight points can depend on your class and the various phases of a zone's questline. The several new zones from Cataclysm are included as well along the Seahorse flight points in Vashir, but each of these Cataclysm zones usually only added 3 or 4 more flight points per zone. Caveats aside, overall, Cataclysm added roughly 4 times the number of flight points to the Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor than WoW had in vanilla. These increased flight points were not without controversy either. This added a ton of convenience, but made the world feel much smaller. Multiple flight points could now be found in every zone, whereas in vanilla, there might be 1 or even no flight points in a zone. More flight points also meant flight routes were much shorter since the player didn't have to fly further out of the way to get from one waypoint to another and could now just go in a more straight line of flight points. After all, the shortest distance between any 2 points is a direct line, at least in Euclidean geometry. One notable quest and daily quest that should be mentioned when talking about flying, and that is the Joust quest in Mount Hyjal. This quest's name is called Vigilance on Wings and can be repeated daily. For this quest, players must enter a pocket of the Firelands from Mount Hyjal and equip a lance. While flapping on this bird, the player must joust and kill 10 Twilight Lancers. This quest is notorious when first trying to do, as mechanics are really wonky and weird. This quest seems to be a leftover idea for mounted combat in Wrath, and the quest is notable for being the last quest where mounted combat was completely controlled by the player. In future expansions, Blizzard would just give the player's buttons a push while on a moving vehicle or mount, and the player would follow a predetermined path set by the quest. Also, if the player did this quest 10 times, it'd be awarded with an achievement and a pet. Finally, Cataclysm saw the introduction of some flying trainers to the faction capitals. In Stormwind, Brala Cloudwing, a Wildhammer Dwarf, was added as a flying trainer next to the flight point. Similarly, in Orgrimmar, Mazda was added as a flying trainer near the flight point between the 2 Zeppelin towers. This made learning to fly much more easier, as the player no longer had to travel to Outland or Dalaran. The next expansion in Mists of Pandaria, and the spell to learn flying on the continent, was named Wisdom of the Four Winds. Pandaria flying could be bought at level 90 for 2,500 gold. Similar to Wrath, players could also buy a Grimoire of the Four Winds and mail it to an alt so they could learn Pandarian flying. Both Wisdom of the Four Winds and the Grimoire could be bought at the faction shrine in the Vale of Eternal Blossoms. Alliance players could talk to Cloudrunner Lang at the Shrine of 7 Stars to learn Pandarian flying, and Horde players could talk to Skydancer Shun at the Shrine of 2 Moons. During early MoP, players also had to learn the Cloud Serpent riding skill if they wished to ride the Cloud Serpents from the Order of the Cloud Serpent. This passive could only be learned when the player had exalted with the faction Order of the Cloud Serpent and completed the final quest associated with the faction named Riding the Skies. After completing this quest, the player could fly Cloud Serpents, but only on a character who had hit Exalted and done the capstone quest. Since Cloud Serpent riding was not account-wide, this meant you had to grind out Cloud Serpent rep on each of your individual characters if you wanted to earn it on that character. Similarly to Cataclysm, smaller patch zones and islands in MoP did not allow for riding, and these zones are the Isle of Giants, the Isle of Thunder, and the Timeless Isle. With WoW's 5th expansion, Warlords of Draenor, saw the introduction of the Pathfinder system. In order to fly in Warlords of Draenor, players had to complete the meta achievement Draenor Pathfinder. Not only was this achievement long and tedious, but it was not available until patch 6.2.2, nearly a year after WoD launch. This was by far the longest players had to wait to be able to fly an expansion up to this point. The Draenor Pathfinder consisted of 6 different achievements, with some variations for Alliance and Horde players. To be able to fly in Draenor, players had to completely explore all 6 WoD zones, complete all the bonus objectives and zone questlines, earn Revered with the 3 factions in the Tandan Jungle, and finally loot 100 treasures. Many players did not even bother to earn this achievement, even after the expansion became old content. And that's pretty much it for this infamous flying fiasco. But there are a few other flying-related things that happen in Worlds of Draenor. First, the Draenor Pathfinder achievement also granted the player the Soaring Sky Terror mount. Second, there was no flight on Ashran, and the 2 main faction encampments on the 2 ends of the island also had no player flight for both gameplay and technical purposes. And finally, at the very beginning of WoD, Cloud Serpent riding from Mists of Pandaria was removed from the game. Next, we move on to the Legion expansion. Legion continued the Pathfinder achievement system, and the achievement that must be earned to fly in the Broken Isles is unsurprisingly called Broken Isles Pathfinder. There are actually 2 Broken Isles Pathfinder achievements, broken into Part 1 and Part 2. Broken Isles Pathfinder Part 1 allowed for faster riding in all the 5 main zones of the Broken Isles and was added in 7.0. Its requirements are exploring all 5 original 7.0 zones of the Broken Isles, doing all the zone questlines, doing the player's class order hall campaign, earning Revered with the 6 original factions of 7.0, and completing 100 world quests. Broken Isles Pathfinder Part 2 allowed for flying on the Broken Isles and on the Broken Shore. It was added in patch 7.2, meaning players had to wait at least 5 months before they could fly the Broken Isles. Its requirements are earning Revere with the Armage of Legionfall, exploring the Broken Shore, and completing Broken Isles Pathfinder Part 1. Flying was not permitted on Argus in patch 7.3, probably due to both gameplay and technical restrictions. Flying on Argus certainly would be very nice to have, however. All the Broken Isles can be flown in, with the exception of the Hunter and Druid Order halls if the player is not of that class. Also, flying too close to Shal Drasil will cause the player to succumb to the Nightmare. Legion also saw the introduction of the Flightmaster's Whistle. Although it was locked behind an achievement and a quest, it was definitely a very good quality of life upgrade before flying became available in the Broken Isles. Patch 7.2.5 also added the first scouting map heirlooms to the game. These first 4 heirloom toys could be bought each for 10,000 gold at heirloom vendors. Any character could use them to learn all the flight points and paths in the Eastern Kingdom and Kalimdor. There were 4 initially because there are 2 original continents in WoW and the 2 factions. Finally, patch 7.3.5 removed several of the old flying requirements. These included cold weather flying for flying in Northrend, the Flightmaster's license for Cataclysm Zone, and the Wisdom of the Four Winds for flying in Pandaria. Next we move on to WoW's 7th expansion, Battle for Azeroth. Like Legion, Battle for Azeroth had 2 Pathfinder achievements, with the Battle for Azeroth Pathfinder Part 1 coming in 8.0, and players could finally fly upon completing Battle for Azeroth Pathfinder Part 2, which became available in patch 8.2, nearly a year after BFA launched. Both Pathfinder requirements are almost identical to those in Legion. These tasks included having to explore these new zones, do all the zones' questlines in the war campaign, earn Revered with all the new factions, and complete 100 world quests. In patch 8.1, the flight paths for the Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor were updated to be higher resolution. BFA also brought the Netomatic into the game, which is a way to dismount flying players in the air while they're in war mode. BFA also had another version of the Flightmaster's Whistle, which just allowed you to use it in BFA zones. With the Shadowlands level squish, the Pathfinder requirement to fly in both Draenor and Legion were removed. Shadowlands also infamously saw no flying in the Maw or Korthia. In patch 9.2, new scouting map heirlooms were added for all the continents and zones. Each map still cost 10,000 gold. Now that we've covered this history of WoW flying up to Shadowlands, we want to briefly discuss what problems dragon riding and dragonflight might be trying to address. First, any player will know long flights or flight paths can be very boring. There is no player involvement other than looking around, which leads to a considerable lack of player engagement. Flight paths and long flying rides in WoW are well known as being an AFK simulator, and players often use this time as breaks to perform various other tasks in real life. Additionally, there is no player dismounting in flight paths, and players must wait until they reach the next flight master to dismount when they click the exit vehicle button. This is especially frustrating. A prime example of this is when you see a rare and fly right over it, and you have to wait to get to the nearest flight master, fly back to the rare, and find out it's already dead. Of course, Blizzard could always add more portals, waypoints, or way shrines, but that makes the actual World of Warcraft feel much smaller and overall less entertaining to a larger extent. Dragon riding makes the act of flying more harder in exchange for being faster, and it seems to solve a lot of these problems. Although you still have the option to just take a flight path if you don't want to deal with actively flying across the continent for a world quest. Reputations are gained through various means and appear in the reputation tab on the character sheet. They have various levels with various values going from lowest to highest. Hated and hostile. Both of these mean the players will be attacked on sight by anyone part of those factions. Next is unfriendly. You cannot interact with anyone in these factions. Then we have neutral, and this is where you start for most reputations. Then friendly and honored, then revered, and then exalted. Unlocking the higher levels of rep does a few things. First off, it gives you an achievement. Second off, higher reps give access to new vendor items and new quests. And lastly, higher levels of rep give discounts from vendors affiliated with that rep. Friendly gives a 5%, honored 10%, revered a 15%, and exalted a 20% discount. There are a few common ways to gain rep, the most common being just doing quests, daily quests, and world quests for that factions. And the other is killing mobs. Many reputations simply have the player kill tons of mobs, with each mob kill giving a bit of rep. This was basically the most common way to gain rep in the early days of WoW. Nowadays it's usually through quests. And with all the basics covered, let's begin with the actual history of reps. First, we start off with vanilla WoW. We have the major races reputations, Darnassus, Nomergon Exiles, Ironforge, Stormwind for Alliance, and for Horde, the Darkspear Trolls, Orgrimmar, Thunderbluff, and Undercity. These reps gave access to racial mounts and discounts in their major city, and, well, to gain the reps, the most common way was to simply do quests for these factions, or to donate cloth to them. Next we have the PvP reps, the League of Arathar for the Alliance and the Defilers for Horde, granted by doing Arathi Basin Battlegrounds. The Silverwing Sentinels and Warsong Outriders, these reps granted by playing the Warsong Gulch Battleground. And lastly, the Stormpike Guard and Frostwolf Clan, granted by playing in the Alterac Valley Battleground, by completing quests and killing players. This was also a great way to get reputation for the racial factions too. These factions allowed access to purchasing some decent epic gear, with the Alterac Valley reps allowing you to buy an epic mount, the Stormpike Battle Charger for Alliance, or the Frostwolf Howler for Horde, both bought at Exalted. Next is the Steamweedle Cartel. These goblin-based reps were gained at the same time, as most sources for gaining rep with them granted you rep with all of them. Completing quests in goblin-based zones, like Stranglethorn and Ratchet. You could also gain rep with these factions by killing Bloodseer Buccaneers. These pirates could be found in Tanaris and Stranglethorn, and killing them granted you rep with all 4 Steamweedle Cartel factions. while also reducing reputation with the Blood Cell Buccaneers. Speaking of them, the next rep is the Blood Cell Buccaneers. This reputation was gained by helping the Blood Cell Buccaneers and slaying members of the Steam-wheeled cartel. The only real rewards were a couple of cosmetic items to look like a pirate. Next is the raid reputations. These reputations were gained almost entirely through raids, by killing mobs and bosses inside the raid of choice, and completing quests as well. They were sometimes farmable outside the raid too, though. The Brood of Nozdormu, this rep was a huge part of the Shifting Sands questline, but how you get this rep was by killing bugs within Silithus for days to weeks on end, depending on how many people you have helping you. However, once the gates of AQ opened, you could get this rep by completing AQ 40. The main rewards were really just a ring you could upgrade as you gained rep, and was required to turn in your set tokens for AQ 40. Next is the Cenarian Circle. This rep comes from completing quests and killing Twilight mobs in Silithus, as well as doing Lunar Festival quests and killing mobs in AQ 20/40. This rep was used to earn rewards you needed to farm in Silithus. Some quite good items too, like the Rock Fury Bracers. The Hydraxian Waterlords rep was earned by killing mobs in Silithus, but that ended rather quickly. After that, the only way to get rep was by killing mobs and bosses in the Molten Core. This rep was required by a raid to be able to summon Major Domo Executus and slay Ragnaros, as you needed to douse the burning runes within the raid to summon the Fire Lord. And to do this, you needed to unlock the dousing vials from the Hydraxian Waterlords first. Lastly is the Zandalari tribe. This reputation was gained by killing mobs in Zul'Gurub, and handed in coins or bijos. This rep was required to get a free necklace that would upgrade as you gained rep, while also being needed for your armor set for the raid, and to earn the right to purchase enchants from them. Next is the Other category. This includes the earlier mentioned Blood Cell Buccaneers, also includes the Darkmoon Fair. This reputation was gained by turn in rare quests, a couple of one-time quests, and also card decks. The only real benefits of this was discounts at purchasing goods there. Next was the Argent Dawn. This rep was gained by doing various undead dungeons, specifically those within the Eastern and Western Plaguelands. You could also gain even more rep by using Argent Dawn trinkets. These trinkets, while worn, allowed you to gather Scourge Stones from the undead in dungeons and out in the world, and turn them in for extra rep. This rep was used to purchase a couple of various things like enchants, but really the major thing was at the end of vanilla. With the introduction of Naxxramas, this rep was now obtainable through doing Naxxramas, but was also required to enter Naxxramas. Sort of. See, you needed at least Honored to attune yourself to Naxxramas, so if you were below Honor, there was absolutely no way to attune to Nax, meaning you couldn't enter the raid. However, once you reached Honored, you would be told, if you want to attune to Naxxramas, you have to pay me 60 gold, 5 arcane crystals, 2 nexus crystals, and 1 righteous orb. However, if you reached Revered, the price got massively reduced, down to 30 gold, 2 arcane crystals, 1 nexus crystal, and if you were Exalted, the attunement was free, so the higher the rep, the cheaper your attunement was. Next is the Gelkis and the Magram clan centaur. These two clans were found within Desolace, and by killing members of the opposite clan, you would gain rep with them. There was not really any unique rewards for them, nor any real reason to gain them other than unlocking a few quests while leveling. Next is the Shendalar. This rep had no real rewards and was simply gained by handing in Dire Maul books and Librams. Next is Ravenhold. This rep was gained by handing in junk boxes gained by pickpocketing mobs and by killing syndicate mobs in the Hillsbrad and Alteric Mountains, but only up to Revered. This, however, would lower your rep with the Syndicate, which was gained by simply killing Ravenhold mobs. These reps had no real unique rewards behind them. Next is the Winter Saber Trainers. This rep was gained by doing constant repeatable quests to go out and do various things in Winter Spring, and eventually led you to be able to obtain the Winter Saber mount. The last two are the Timbermaw Hold and the Thorium Brotherhood. The Timbermaw Hold was gained by killing furbogs in the Winter Spring and Felwood, while also turning in various items that you would get from them like beads and feathers. This rep led to a fair few recipes, most importantly, really good enchanting recipes. And like Timbermaw Hold, Thorium Brotherhood was mainly gained for its recipes. This rep required you to turn in countless items found all over Azeroth, however, of course, to do with fire and rock mostly. And unlocking this rep was required for a ton of fire resist crafting recipes, as well as the recipe for the Sulfuron Hammer needed for the legendary Sulfuron Hand of Ragnaros. Just a couple more, we're almost done with the vanilla reps. The first is the Wildhammer clan. This reputation was gained by gathering items from trolls in the hinterlands and handing them in, however, with no actual rewards. This rep was removed the launch of the Burning Crusade. However, you would think this would make this the first removed reputation from the game. No, that spot goes to the Reventus tribe. This rep was gained by doing quests in the Reventus village, but the faction was removed in patch 1.11. Before we move on to the Burning Crusade, there were actually 2 factions mentioned in patch 1.6 that never got made available to players. Theramore, which would likely have been earned by doing content in Theramore, and various connected ports. And the Silvermoon Remnant, both Alliance factions. The Silvermoon Remnant seems to have been hinted as a plan to add more quest locations for High Elven hubs. Maybe even High Elves coming to the Alliance? Now on to the Burning Crusade. This expansion introduced the daily quest system, and with this now made reputations grind far more important, and also made them more time-gated, as for a few reps the only way to gain reps with them was to do dailies. The Burning Crusade had a huge reliance on reps. While being able to earn them from dungeons, they were also required for attunements, allowing you to enter dungeons and raids. While Vanilla WoW had a couple of attunements, the Burning Crusade really blew it out of the water. First off, with the new Draenei and Blood Elf race, we got access to the Exodar and Silvermoon reps. Again, reduced prices within their cities and also allowing you to buy their racial mounts, while being earned from just doing various quests. Next, we have the new raid reputations. The Scale of Sands was earned by killing mobs within the Battle for Mount Hydro raid, and gave access to rings as well as gem recipes for the new jewel crafting profession. And also the Ash Tongue Death Swarm. This rep was earned by killing mobs in the Black Temple, and allowed you to get several crafting recipes and even class trinkets with unique effects based on your class. Next is the reputation called the Keepers of Time, earned by killing mobs and escape from Durnhold Dungeon and inside the Black Morass. This rep allowed you to buy various recipes, blue pieces of gear, and a couple epic items too at Exalted. Then we have Tranquillion. This reputation was earned by completing quests and turning in quest items in the Ghostlands, mostly gained by Blood Elves while leveling. This rep sold nothing but some low-level green items. And hey, if you got all the way to Exalted with this rep, you could buy a level 21 blue item at least. So really, one of the most forgettable reps of the Burning Crusade. The Violet Eye, earned by killing mobs within Karazhan. This reputation allowed you to receive a special ring depending on your role, increasing its power as you gained more and more rep, just like the ring from the Brood of Nozdormu, the neck from the Zandalari tribe, and more. You could also get a fair few recipes for various professions. Shattrath City is the major hub in the Burning Crusade, and with this, there are many factions found within it. First is the Lower City. Doing quests within Terakar Forest and running various dungeons within Auchindoom granted you rep with this faction. Its rewards were pretty general, a couple crafting recipes and a couple bits of gear. Next is the Aldor and Scryers. Upon arriving in the city, players could choose to join one of these factions, the Aldor Draenei or the Scryer Blood Elves. Each faction sold again general things, recipes, gear, and more importantly, a couple of enchants. These reputations were gained by turning in various items earned from world content and raids. The Aldor accepted Marks of Kil'jaeden, Marks of Sargeras, and Fel armaments. The Scryers took Fire Wing Signets, Sun Fury Signets, and Arcane Tomes. Gaining rep with one faction would lose you rep with the others. And while you could swap to the other using Dampscale Basilisk Eye, it was expensive and time consuming, so make sure you know exactly who you're going to join, and if you're going to change early. The Shatar was gained by running Tempest Keep instances and doing quests. Yet again, rather generic rewards, some crafting recipes, some basic gear, as well as some enchants. The Shattered Sun Offensive was a reputation that was mostly gained by doing quests, dungeons, and the raid all in the Isle of Quel'Danas. The rep came yet again with rather basic rewards, random pieces of gear, random crafting recipes, although one unique thing is the necklace at Exalted. This necklace had a special effect if you were exalted with either the Scryers or the Aldar. Next is the Shatari Skyguard. This reputation is our first special reputation. With the Burning Crusade, we finally got some reputations that gave rewards cool enough to be worthwhile farming. Gained by doing quests in Skatis and Orgrilla, this rep gave a couple of capes, but what was really special was the Nether Ray mounts. These mounts being one of the few ways to get a unique flying mount away from the basic lame Griffin or Windrider. Speaking of that, we might as well go over the other 3 special mount reputations. First is the Kuranai or the Maghar. These reputations were earned by killing ogres in Nagran, and turning their beads into the local Broken or Maghar, depending on if you were Alliance or Horde. From them you would get a few patterns, a few pieces of gear, and the Talbook mounts. These Talbooks were a nice way to get away from the old boring, usual racial ground mounts everyone was all used to at this point. Next is the Cenarian Expedition. This reputation was earned by doing quests in Zangamarsh, as well as doing the dungeons within the Coilfang Reservoir. Yet again, gear, recipes for crafting, but the most important of all, the Cenarian War Hippogriff mount, a mount usually only seen during flight paths within Night Elven area zones. Both Alliance and Horde could now use this mount as their flying mount anywhere they wanted, in Outland at least, because in the TBC you could only fly in the Outlands. And lastly, saving the best for last, this one was unique, the Netherwing. This reputation was earned with a long quest line within the Shadowmoon Valley, dailies and quest chains. You eventually would unlock this epic mix of dragon, shark, and magic. even earning the right to choose one of these mounts for free. The rest then being able to be purchased if you wanted more colors. These mounts even today still look amazing, even if they are rather low quality. Now back to the more basic reputations. Honor Hold / Thrallmar. These reputations were earned by doing content within the Hellfire Peninsula, as well as running instances within the Hellfire Citadel, and typical as usual, the rep rewards were pretty basic, some crafting recipes, some bits of gear, and a couple of enchants. Ogrilla. This reputation had many basic rewards, simply gear and consumables. However, what made this special was its currencies, including Apexis crystals and Apexis shards. These items were used for, and earned by, dailies in the Bladehead's Mountain, killing demons and playing Simon Says. This rep really was not well liked because it just took forever to grind. Although, you could find rare depleted items, and these items could be combined with Apexis shards to activate them, making them useful pieces of gear, and were bind on equip, so they could be sold on the auction house. Sporgar. By doing quests within Zangarmarsh for these mushroom folk and running Underbog, you could gain rep with this faction, and for going through the trouble, you could get a couple of crafting recipes and a couple pieces of gear. Although really, the biggest thing simply being the tiny Spore Rat pet, all purchased with the special currency glow caps found all over the zone. With the introduction of the micro-holidays, there is one micro-holiday around this reputation which allows you to grind it all the way to Exalted in one day if you simply participate in the event. Lastly, the Consortium. This reputation was earned by doing quests in various places of Outlands to do with Ethereals, as well as running the Mana Tombs dungeon. This rep was quite important for a reason we'll go over in a bit. But like most other reps, reward-wise it was super basic, crafting recipes and a few pieces of gear. Now, to go over the attunement part we spoke about earlier, we wanted to go over it all at once instead of going over each one of them individually. To unlock heroic dungeons, you needed to get revered reputation with specific reps, and these are Honor Hold / Thrallmar for Hellfire Citadel, Cenarian Expedition for the Kolfang Reservoir, Lower City for Auchendoom, and Shatar for Tempest Keep, and the Keepers of Time for the Caverns of Time. Now that the heroic dungeons are unlocked, you would still need to do a few other things, including later needing to be honored with the Violent Hold to obtain the Blackened Urn questline required to summon Nightbane, which is one of the steps required to unlock Serpent Shrine Cavern. Luckily, that's it for the reps required for the insanely huge process of attuning to content in the Burning Crusade. Now we move on to Wrath of the Lich King. Of course, the biggest feature is the achievements, which added achievements for most of the old reps, including titles for getting specific ones, something we'll bring up later for you. First thing is the Argent Tournament. This new questing hub in Northrend had you becoming champions of your faction's races, allowing you to earn reputations for those factions and even buy special mounts, titles, pets, and more for becoming the champions of those factions. Next, we move on to the Frenzy Heart Tribe and the Oracles. These reps were found in the Sholzar Basin, and by doing dailies you can gain rep with one of them, as you would start with the Frenzy Heart, then switch over to the Oracles, and then eventually make a choice to join one of the two factions, becoming an enemy with the other. The Frenzy Heart had a couple bits of gear, some recipes, and a toy, but the Oracles, they were the real one everyone wanted, because they gave much in the same, however, they also sold an egg, that after a few days of being in your bag, could be opened for a chance at a pet, or the Green Protodrake. And why was this important? Well, for one, Protodrakes are really cool, and two, this is one of the easier 310% mount speeds to obtain, because back in the Burning Crusade and Wrath, if you wanted to fly at 310 speed, you needed to find specific mounts that had that mount speed already. Then we have the Sons of Hador rep, which was found in the Storm Peaks. This rep is gained by doing daily quests or handed in scraps of metal found from rune dwarves in the zone. The items from this rep, yet again, basic, some bits of gear, some enchants, some recipes, but two mounts, the important one being the Grand Ice Mammoth, a 3-person ground mount. Wrath of the Lich King became the expansion to release the multiple-person mounts. Knights of the Ebon Blade is a rep to do with the Death Knights, freed from the power of the Lich King, and by allying with these Death Knights and assisting them in dismantling the Lich King's forces, allow you to again, buy some bits of gear, some recipes, and some enchants. The Kaluak. These humanoid walruses could be found inside the Boran Tundra, Dragonspire, and the Howling Fjord, requiring you to do a daily quest in each zone every single day, or even compete in the weekly fishing contest at Northrend, sadly having been removed later on in the game. But hey, this rep gave some of the usual stuff, a few bits of gear, some crafting materials, a pet penguin, and also a couple of fishing items, like an epic fishing pole. Next is the Wyrmrester Court. Doing quests in Dragonblight and Caldera gave rep with this faction, this rep being required to buy gear, recipes, and also the Reigns of the Red Drake. Now onto the last two neutral reps of Wrath of the Lich King. First, the Ashen Verdict.
This rep is gained by doing Icecrown Citadel, killing bosses and trash. Unlocking this rep gives progression towards a ring that with each rep level becomes stronger and stronger, much like the reps from the past expansions. This rep was also required for a ton of different recipes from the Icecrown Citadel vendor. Cure and Tor. This rep was gained by doing daily quests in Dalaran, some of them even being profession specific, like jewel crafting, cooking, and fishing. This allowed you to buy, yet again, recipes, gear, and enchants. Now onto the faction-specific reps. First is the Silver Covenant and the Sun Reavers, the factions of High Elves and Blood Elves found in Dalaran and the Grand Crusade base in Northrend. This rep is gained by doing quests and daily quests in Northrend for the Argent Tournament, and is required to buy a few things, not just for the reps but from the others, also required to become champions of the other base factions. The three main things you can buy are the Steed or Hawkstrider, and a Hippogriff or Dragonhawk, and lastly a pet Shimmering Wormling. The Hippogriff, being Alliance only, was the second in-game Hippogriff mount. Now onto the Alliance Vanguard and the Horde Expedition. These reps were really more of a ton of reps combined together, so we'll go over them quickly. The special thing was that by gaining one of these reps, you got rep with the other respective parent faction. So, for example, the first is the Alliance Vanguard. As mentioned above, Silver Covenant, gaining rep with them also gave you rep with the Alliance Vanguard. Rep could even spill over to help you farm the other reps. The other three were the Explorers League, gained through questing the Howling Fjord, the Frostborn by questing in Storm Peaks, and the Valiant's Expedition by doing quests in Born Tundra, Grizzly Hills, Howling Fjord, and Dragonblight. The Alliance Expedition had some decent gear, an enchant, and a pair of recipes, including the recipe for the first two-person mount, the Mechaneer's Chopper, crafted and sold on the auction house by engineers. The Valiant's Expedition, the Explorers League, and the Frostborn did not actually have any rep vendor rewards themselves. Now onto the Horde version, the Horde Expedition. Just like the Alliance Vanguard, it had 4 reps within it. The Sun Reavers, which had most of the rewards. It also had the Tonka, the Hand of Vengeance, and the Warsong Offensive. These 3 reps also have no real rewards, but the parent rep itself had some gear, an enchant, and a pair of recipes. Again, one of them the special engineering mount recipe for the Mechanohawk, the Horde version of the Mechaneer's Chopper. Before we move on to the Cataclysm, there's one more thing to mention: tabards. Before Wrath, some reps had tabards that, well, they looked cool and showed you were exalted with that faction. However, with Wrath of the Lich Kings, tabards got a new use. Many of the Wrath tabards could be bought at friendly, and when equipped, mobs and bosses killed in heroic dungeons gave you rep with that specific rep. And this is how many reps were best farmed in Wrath of the Lich King, but not all of them had them, of course. Then in Cataclysm, they introduced these tabards to many of the old reps, including all of the old racial reps, and the new Goblin and Worgen ones. Now, onto the full-fledged Cataclysm reps. First, we have the reps of Mount Hyjal. The Guardians of Hyjal rep was gained by doing quests in Mount Hyjal, mainly within the Molten Front, and was used to buy a caster head enchant, some blue and purple gear, and of course the tabard, as pretty much every single rep from now on has. Next is the Avengers of Hyjal. This rep was killed by killing bosses in Trash and Firelands, and this rep really sold nothing but some Firelands raiding gear. Next is the Deepholm reps. The Earthen Ring is gained by doing quests in Deepholm, Mount Hyjal, and Vashir, although of course mainly Deepholm. Getting this rep allowed you to buy a tanking enchant, some blue gear, and purple gear. Then is Therazane, by doing quests in Deepholm while also killing Twilight Hammer cultists. Getting this rep allowed you to buy a lot of different enchants as well as a few rings. Then in Tol Barad, we had the Baradin's Warden and Hellscream's Reach, the same faction but an Alliance and Horde version each. These vendors sold various enchants, consumables, gear, and a fair few toys, as well as some mounts, like the Draco of the West Wind and the Spectral Wolf or Spectral Horse, depending on your faction. And you gain rep for them by doing dailies with Tol Barad, the Open World Zone, and the Open World Battleground section of it. Next, we have the next set of faction-specific reps, the Dragonmaw Clan and the Wildhammer Clan, Horde and Alliance respectively. These reps were gained by doing quests in the Twilight Highlands and reward players with access to a couple bits of gear and enchants for strength users. And last, we have the Ramkahen Tribe. This rep, situated in Uldum, was gained by doing dailies both one-time and repeatable there. Players who gained rep with this faction were able to buy an agility enchant with it, as well as a fair bit of gear, and the Brown Riding Camel and the Tan Riding Camel mounts. After the destruction of the Cataclysm, we move on to the lands of Pandaria, and with that, a few new reps, as well as a few new rep systems. First off, a new type of rep called Best Friendship. His reputation is usually with a singular character instead of an entire faction, and only has a few ranks with different values, far different than the usual friendly, honored, revered, exalted seen usually. The second major thing is once the player gained Revere with most of these reps found in Pandaria, they could buy a token that, once used, gave characters on their accounts 50% bonus rep with that faction from all future content. This not only made it easier to get reps with alts, as rep was required to buy a lot of endgame gear in Pandaria, as the currency valor was spent on this rep gear, it also made it so you gained exalted status 50% faster than normal. Third and final is the Zandalari Warbringers. Added with patch 5.2, each of the coastal zones of the Pandaria you could find Zandalari rares at specific locations that, once killed, could drop insignias for many different Pandaria basic reps. These could be mailed to alts and was a great way to passively gain rep for yourself and your alts, while also killing rares for a chance at mounts and mini resources. Most of the reps in Pandaria were neutral, but there are a few factions-based ones, so we'll go over those ones first. The Kirin-Tor Offensive and the Sunreaver Onslaught were the Silver Covenants and Sunreaver forces that set up bases on the shores of the Thunder Isles. These reps could be gained by doing either PvE or PvP content on the island, and was quite a cool rep overall, with rewards like the Direhorn mounts, banner toys, and gear. Then we have the Operation Shield Wall and Dominance Offensive. These reps were gained by doing daily quests and even world PvP, as well as some unique quest lines to do with factions fighting each other all over the Krasarang Wilds. The rewards were a lot of good gear, some toys, and the unique Grand Armored Griffin and the Wyvern. These being up-resed versions of the Griffin and Wyvern, bringing the typical flying mounts into the new decade. And last for the faction specific are the Pearlfin Jinyu for the Alliance and the Forest Hosen for the Horde. As the factions arrived in the Jade Forest, they recruited these races to help them. Sadly, the first possible allied races that were ever hinted at in BFA, but never came to be. These factions really had nothing special reward-wise, just a fishy pet and a couple of weapons. Now onto the neutral reps. First is the Anglers. This rep was gained by fishing up 3 rare fish, each being found in very specific locations. This rep is what allowed players to get the Azure Water Strider, the water walking mount that has its own entire story we could go over in its own video, as well as a couple of cooking recipes, pets, fishing poles, and fishing accessories, including a book that allowed you to instantly level up your alt's fishing levels. On top of this, Nat Pagal has one of those new friendship reps, which by leveling your friendship with him allows you to get Nat Hat, a fishing hat. Next rep is the August Celestial. This rep was gained by being sent to one of the 4 celestial temples and doing dailies for them, giving you crafting recipes and the Thunder August Cloud Serpent. It also gave a coin called the Celestial Offering that granted the player a buff while it was in their bag, so as long as you were near a temple, the buff being based on which temple you were near. Next we have the Golden Lotus. This rep was originally gained by just doing daily quests. However, with the destruction of the Veil by Garrosh, many of the dailies were lost, now allowing players to do a couple of things to gain rep. First, going around and killing mobs. Second, search for hidden treasures containing rep items. And your reward for maxing this rep was a fair few crafting recipes, a unique CC trinket, and a few crane mounts. The Regal, Azure, and Golden Riding Cranes to be exact. The Hojin Pandaren and the Tushui Pandaren. These reps act as the racial reps for the Pandaren, for the Horde and Alliance factions of the Pandaren. These reps are gained by doing quests and rewards wearing their tabards. Unlocking them gives a few basic things like their racial mounts. Next we have the Calaxi, a faction gained by doing long quest lines, as well as dailies and handing in dread shards found from mobs. This faction allowed players to buy massive amounts of blacksmithing recipes, as well as a few amber-based weapons, and the most unique reward being an amber scorpion. Now onto the Lore Walkers. This rep is gained by flying to specific locations around Pandaria and collecting lost scrolls. By turning all of these in, you are guaranteed to Exalted. And for this, you are granted a ton of items available at the vendor to do with archaeology, and even a mount, the Disc of the Red Flying Cloud, letting you fly around on a disc floating above a cloud. The Order of the Cloud Serpent is gained by doing dailies for the Serpent Masters, just like the Netherwing and Winter Sabers. But just like the Netherwing, you can speed this up by flying around searching for serpent eggs to hand in for extra rep. The player can then buy a couple of recipes for jewel crafting mounts, the Jeweled Panthers, a couple pet toys, and raise their own Cloud Serpent to unlock a Golden, Azure, and Jade Serpent. Next is Emperor Xiao Hao. This rep is gained by doing literally anything and everything on the Timeless Isle, killing mobs, handing in quests, everything. And for doing this, the main rewards are gear, a trinket to teleport there, some toys, and the reins of the Heavenly Golden Cloud Serpent. Shadowpan, which is gained from specific quest hubs, which even allowed you to bring a companion to help you do your dailies, had you dealing with the Yungol and the Mantid, all to gain rewards like crafting recipes, some replica Shadowpan hats, and the Shadowpan mounts, coming in red, blue, and green armor plating. The Shadowpan Assault, another rep to do with the Shadowpan, is gained by doing content in the Isle of Thunder, clearing bosses and trash within the raid, or doing a weekly Dungeon Delve event within the Vault of the Thunder King. This vendor sells really nothing special other than a ton of gear. Next is the Black Prince. This rep was gained in many ways, killing Celestials in the Timeless Isle and Mogu from various areas. The newer the content, the higher the rep, as upon hitting Revered, the only real place to farm rep was the animated warriors in the Thunder Isle, a place people spent hours just killing nearly instantly spawned warriors all in one spot. And well, what was it for? The rep was required for the legendary questline to get the Pandaria legendary cloak. And lastly, we end on the tillers. This rep allowed you to buy many cooking items, some toys, and seeds for your farm. The very first version of the garrison system we saw in WoD with the garrison, Legion with the class halls, Shadowlands with the Covenant hall. This rep also sold the brown, black, and white riding goats. To gain this rep, players would need to do daily quests for the members of the Half-Hill, as well as grow plants on their farm. But what made this rep very special was the friendship system I mentioned earlier. Like Nat Pagel, there was a friendship reps underneath, and each of these friendships gave you special benefits if you max them out. Old Heelpaw added chickens to your farm and gave you a straw hat. Ella adds Luna the cat in a tree seed packs. Fish Fellreed adds pigs in a special seed pack. Farmer Fung adds a prized yak and some enigma seeds. Gina Mudclaw adds a mailbox and a ton of fireworks. Sho sends you a cricket pet and an orange tree to your farm. Chi-Chi sends a goodie box with cloth and leather, as well as sending some sheep to your farm. Howhan Mudclaw sends you some songbell seeds and adds a Mushin Miss Fifi to your farm. Jogu sends you a ton of alcohol with no longer charging you for the crop predictions. And Tina Mudclaw sends you food and adds furniture to your farm. And that's it for Pandaria. Now we leave Azeroth once again to return to Draenor, with Warlords of Draenor. The Saberstalker's rep was gained by killing Saberon and Fangorilla, as well as a single daily. This rep allowed players to buy a contract to unlock the Follower Palas, as well as some pets and a mount speed increase while in the Tannan jungle. The Bristling Hellboar, the Savage Cub, and the Wild Gore Tusk. Order of the Awakened is a rep gained by killing rares and gathering treasures in the Tannan jungle. This allowed you to buy a pet, a toy, and a couple of other random items, but the major things being the contract for the Follower's Solar Priest Vax. And the awesome looking mount, Reigns of the Corrupted Dreadwing. The Hand of the Prophet and the Vol'jin Headhunters. These reps were for Alliance and Horde respectively. These reps were gained by doing daily Tannan quests and completing some garrison quests. The main reward being the Death Tusk Fellboar, and sold tons of blueprints for your shipyard, like the oil rig and the battleship. It also sold the Empowered Augment Rune, the infinite use augment rune of the expansion. Next is the Council of the Exarchs and the Frostwolf Orcs. Again, faction focused, these reps were gained by doing specific quest lines in the relevant zones, as well as your garrison, and gave you fall rewards, mounts like the Dusty Rockhide for Alliance, and the Swift Frostwolf for Horde, as well as custom titles and toys. Aarakocra Outcast rep is gained by questing within the Spires of Iraq and Talador, while also killing mobs in these zones. This rep was required to let you buy crates of fragments for archaeology, like the Lore Walkers of Mop. They also sold the Shadowmane Charger Mount, the Son of Seathpet, and many other little items like a trinket. The Steamweedle Preservation Society is a rep gained by doing quests in Negran, and also killing special named beasts within Negran, then turning in their artifacts for rep. The main reward being the Domesticated Razorback, but on top of that, a few pets and a bits of gear. The next two are the Vol'jin Spear and Rim's Vanguard. These are Ashran reps for the Horde and Alliance. Getting these reps are easy by doing objectives in Ashran, and allow you to buy special mounts, like the Bree Strider Stallion and the Pale Thorn Grazer, a special toy, the LeBlanc's Recorder, and a few items to assist you in Ashran, with a rep even being required to some of the Warlord Season 1 PvP gear, although that was not continued until later seasons. The Laughing Skull Orcs is the Horde-specific rep gained by specific mobs in Gorgrond, requiring a level 2 trading post, this selling the Ironside Warwolf and the Laughing Skull Cosmetic Mask, great for transmogs. Meanwhile, the Alliance version throws us out of the water, gained the same way, killing specific mobs, instead this time in Talador. This allows you to buy the entire Shatari defense armor set, as well as the armored Iron Tusk mount. Before we move on to Legion, there was the Medallion of the Legion, found on special world boss-like rares in the Tannan jungle. They could even be sold at the auction house, and used to give you 1000 rep in the following reps shown on screen. Okay, but before we move on to the next one, we have to talk about the bodyguards. These garrison followers could be found out in the world, and if you had your barracks at level 2, allowing you to have a bodyguard out in the world with you. These bodyguards could be leveled by killing enemies, giving them 10 rep per kill. And by reaching ranks, you would get new quests, and these quests would unlock new ranks for the bodyguards, giving them special effects to summon your party/raid members to your location, summon a portal to your garrison, summon a command table anywhere you wanted, summon a portable mailbox, and summon a follower who could repair your gear. Now we go to Legion. With the introduction of world quests, we rely far less on dailies, and far less on just killing mobs. We also get introduced to Paragon caches. See, once players got to Exalted, they could now continue gaining rep after that point, and if they got 10,000, they would get a cache, which inside could contain unique items. Now, there are two types of reps. We will call them emissary reps and special reps. That will pretty much cover every expansion from now on. Emissary reps are gained in a couple of ways. First off, doing quests specific to their zone. Second is to do world quests to do with that faction in their zone. Third is to wait until an emissary spawns. Every day an emissary will spawn and will stay up for 3 days, so you can have up to 3 at once, and these vary in what you need to do. In Legion, they were to simply do 3 to 4 world quests to do with that faction, but come Shadowlands that was entirely changed. And by simply doing world quests associated to the rep during that emissary, and then handing it in, it would give you a massive chunk of rep afterwards. Or you can get a bit of rep for doing them in the Order Hall missions. So, onto the reps themselves. The Nightfallen were a special rep found in Siramar, with their own massive questline, even required for attunements to the Siramar dungeons. This vendor sold a boon that allowed you to get mana crystals on kills, as well as a few bit of gears and crafting recipes, and even the treasure map, putting hidden treasures in the zone on the map, something all the reps have. Their Paragon cache contained the ley-woven flying carpet. Valajar, situated in Stormheim, they had a couple rewards including the usual recipes, items, toys, pets, and a treasure map, but they also had part of the hidden skin for the holy artifact. Their Paragon cache had a chance at the Valajar Stormwing. Next is the Wardens, their world quests being linked to PvP as well, and again, pets, toys, recipes, etc. Their Paragon cache contains Sira's extra cloak, a toy that transforms you into a Warden. The Dreamweavers of Al-Shara contained many druid-themed items, including yet again, toys, pets, gear, and recipes, as well as the Seed of the Solar Flare, an item required for the hidden artifact skin for balanced druids. Their Paragon cache contained the Wild Dream Runner. The High Mountain tribe gained through the content with the High Mountain, again recipes, some gear, some toys, some pets, and their Paragon cache contained the High Mountain Elderhorn. The Quarter Ferondis, a reputation situated within Azuna. These ghost highborn sold recipes, some toys, some pets, some pieces of gear, and the Cyril Crescent Fold Notes, Raven Guard, an item needed for the Hunter Marksman hidden artifact appearance, an Eagle Crossbow. The Reputation box contained the Cloudwake Hippogriff. The next rep is the Armies of Legionfall. This rep was found on the Broken Shore, and contained only a couple rewards, so we'll actually name them by name. The Legion Pocket Portal and the Legion Invasion Simulator toys. The Legion Fall Banner Cauterizing Void Shard, and the repurposed Fel Focuser. And of course, the Legion Fall Tabard. The Paragon cache contained the Orphan Felbat pet. Now onto the final 2 emissary reps of Legion, the Army of the Light and the Argusian Reach, both gained on Argus. The Army of Light sold a fair few recipes, as well as a 500,000 gold mount, the Light Forged Warframe. Their Paragon cache contained 3 different Felcrusher mounts, the Glorious, Blessed, and Avenging, as well as the Holy Light Sphere toy. The Argusian Reach from the Paragon cache had a BOA item that could be consumed to let the player find artifact power from killing enemies. This item ended up being literally useless, as by the time you reached max level at this point, artifact power while leveling was not affected by the research done, which massively increased artifact power found. Upon reaching max level, 1 single bit of artifact power would easily be worth 100 times more than all you had found while leveling combined. The rep itself sold a few recipes as well as a few items, including some pets, toys, updated Talbook models, much like the Broken of Outland, and a mining pick that increased binding speed in Legion content. Before we leave, we have a few more things to talk about. First off are the Kirin Tor, and while the rep itself has no rewards, they would have emissary quests that would grant you rep with the Kirin Tor, but upon completing the emissary, you would get to choose one of the other reps as your reward. Reputation, as it was old, did not have any new rewards added, or a Paragon cache. So instead, you would, alongside the rep award for your emissary, get a special cache that contained the rewards. The most important item being the Strange Humming Crystal, which leads to the Khadgar Head in a Ball, the Wondrous Wisdom Ball pet. And we have a return to the special friendships. We have 2. First, Chromie, which is gained by doing her special scenario, the Deaths of Chromie scenario, which rewarded many things like the Bronze Dragon pets and a bronze recolor of the Dragon Gear of Cataclysm. The others are the Fisher Friends on the Isles. These included Alyssa of the Waters, Corbin, Akul Riverhorn, Impus, Shaleth, Keeper Rene, and Conjure Margos, each gained by collecting special items for them with the relevant fishing poles. These take a long time, only lowered by fishing in raids. But even then, each character takes 2 to 3 hours each in a raid group. The Fisher Friends would rotate each day, all but Margos, who always stayed up. The rewards for them included the Feast of Fish recipes and a whole bunch of different kinds of bobbers and pets. Now, before we leave Legion, we need to talk about allied races. Introduced as Battle for Azeroth, they were added before the launch for those who pre-ordered. However, as in the expansion Battle for Azeroth, they would add more allied races than all of WoW's added races combined and doubled. Massive amounts of races in one single expansion. The cost being you had to unlock these races by gaining their allegiance, and so for the first 4 allied races you would need to gain their favor. For the Horde, the High Mountain Tauren of High Mountain, the Nightborn of Siramar, and for the Alliance, the Void Elves of the Argusian Reach, and the Lightforged Draenei of the Army of Light. Now on to Battle for Azeroth. The first new addition is a new way to gain rep, called contracts. These items could be crafted by scribes once they reach Revere with the faction. Then they could sell these on the auction house, and people could buy them and then consume them, giving them an extra bit of rep for every single world quest they do. However, the extra rep is from that specific contract's chosen reputation. These items used to last forever at first, but were quickly changed to last for an entire week instead. Let's start with the faction-specific reps. Alliance first. The Proudmoore Admiralty was gained by doing content in Tiersgard, and sold a ton of recipes, some gear, and the Proudmoore Sea Scout and Admiralty Stallion. The Paragon Cache contained the Proudmoore Music Box and the Albatross Hatchling. Next is the Order of Embers found in Drustvar, selling many recipes, bits of gear, and the Dusky Waycrest Griffin and Smoky Charger. The Paragon Cache contains the Cobalt Raven and the Bewitching Tea Set. Storm's Wake comes from Stormsong Valley, again selling recipes, some gear, and some various other things. And actually, for ease, you get the point. We'll only mention the more important things for these. So, in addition to the usual pets and mounts, it sold the Tome of Polymorph Bumblebee, which allowed mages to turn people into bees. Their Paragon Cache had a chance at a pet and a glyph recipe. The 7th Legion were gained by doing Warfront content, invasion content on your own continent, and any world quest on the opposing faction continent. Among with the usual stuff, they also sold a little siege tower, with their Paragon Cache having chance at a toy and a contract recipe. The Waveblade and Cohen, this reputation found within Nazjatar, sold a lot of different things, including the Prismatic Softshell and a ton of different Azerite powers for your Heart of Azeroth, with the Paragon Cache containing even more powers, as well as the Memento of the Deeps, the Flopping Fish, and the Glyph of Coldway's recipe. Now into the Horde factions, the Zandalari Empire, found within Zuldazar. They sell the usual mounts, pets, and toys, with the standouts being 2 items that allowed you to hex and polymorph other players into dinosaurs. With their Paragon Cache having the chance at just 1 toy, the War Beast Quarl Dinnerbell. Talandri's Expedition, found in Azmir, sold a few pets and mounts, and from their Paragon Cache they had a chance at a pet or toy. BFA really tried to remove mounts from the Paragon caches, since most of the complaints from Legion was that people didn't like having to farm reputations for a random chance at a mount. However, they were mostly fine if it was a pet or a toy instead. The Voldunai of Vol'dun sold the usual pets, toys, and mounts, with their Paragon Cache having a chance at dropping 3 separate toys. The Honorbound, just like the 7th Legion, are gained by doing Warfront content, invasions, and content in other factions' continents, and sells the little war machine, the Rallowing War Banner, and a contract for the Honorbound from the Paragon Cache. Okay, and last one, the Unshackled, found in Nazjatar. They sell Azerite powers for the neck, as well as toys, pets, and mounts, and from their Paragons, more powers, the Flopping Fish, the Memento of the Deeps, and the recipe for Glyphs of the Cold Waves. Okay, now the neutral ones. Champions of Azeroth, gained by doing world quests for Magni around the South Seas. This vendor sells a couple of pets, while giving the Azerite firework launcher from its Paragon cache. Next is the Tortolan Seekers. This rep is gained by doing world quests for the Tortolans across the South Seas, giving you a pet, a ton of patterns, some gear, and from their Paragon Cache, a few cooking recipes and a chance at 2 different toys. Next is the Rustbolt Resistance. This rep is gained by doing quests and world quests on Mechagon. They sell various Azerite powers, as well as recipes and bits of gear, and some blueprints for the Mechagon's junkyard crafting. As well as selling the Rustbolt Resistor, the Misty First Neuter, with the Paragon Cache having a chance at giving a legendary Azerite power. Then during the last patch of the expansion, they introduced 2 new reps. The Rajani, gained by doing invasions, world quests, and dailies in the Vale of Eternal Blossom, fighting the forces of N'Zoth and the invading Mantid and Mogu. This rep would sell the Windfeather Quill and the Lightning Forged Augment Rune. Their Paragon cache had 2 simple items, 1 the Jade Defender, and 2 the rank 4 of a Heart of Azeroth power. Uldum Accord, same thing but found in, you guessed it, Uldum. Completing invasions, doing world quests and daily quests, you get the Pygmy Camel Pet, the Wastewander Sky Terror, and so on and so on. Paragon Cache has the Cursed Dune Watcher and the rank 4 essence of the Brilliant Death. Now, before we go on to the final expansion so far, TM, we've got the Honeyback Hive. This rep for Alliance only is farmed by gathering honey along Stormsong Valley, allowing you to buy various things to make the rest of your farming easier. You could farm this yourself or even buy them off the auction house. Before Shadowlands, we have one more thing to talk about. More allied races. They added 6 more allied races. First, the Dark Iron Doors for Alliance and the Magheart Orc for Horde. These factions are recruited by gaining rep and doing quests with the 7th Legion and Honorbound. The Kulturan humans, well obviously, doing quests and reps in Kulturas. And the Zandalari Zandalar. The last 2 are the Mechanomes for Alliance and the Volpera for Horde. To unlock these factions, you need to gain rep with their respective factions and do quest lines for them too. And while allied races did require reputations at one point, Blizzard later on removed them due to players' requests. And now you only need to do the main quest lines for these reps. Now onto the Shadowlands. With 9.1 being so fresh, we won't really cover what's coming in that, but there is the new Death's Advance rep, which comes from doing the new content in Korthia, which won't be in this video. But let's talk about 9.0 content. The Covenants themselves with their renown could be called reputations in some ways, but no, they're not reps, so we won't be talking about them. So let's start off with our most favorite broker, Venari. Venari's rep is gained by doing content and quests within the Maw. She's a special friendship rep, and not the usual exalted and such we're used to. And what does she sell? Well, nothing super special, but what she does sell is items to help you complete content in the Maw, as well as stuff to assist you in Torghast. Upgrades like the grappling hooks, extra powers, Torghast shop discounts, etc, etc. There are 3 specific good items she sells though. The Spatial Realignment Apparatus, which allows you to add a gem socket to a few pieces of gear for Stygia costs. The Unbound Reality Fragment allows you to upgrade a random conduit that is in one of your lowest levels, all the way up to 1 tier at a time, capping out at 226. And lastly is the Memory of the Jailer's Eye, a legendary power you can add to one of your crafted legendaries. Now let's go faction by faction based on what zone they're from. First, Bastion. The rep, which is available to all players, is called the Ascendant. This rep is gained by doing world quests and emissaries in Bastion, as well as getting rep tokens for that faction. Their main selling items are the Golden Paw Kit Pet, a legendary multi-class recipe that has a chance to proc damage on attacks, and a mount called the Gilded Prowler. The Paragon Cache for this rep contains a pet and 2 toys. Next, we move on to Maldraxxus with the Undying Army. Gained the same way as the Ascended, but in Maldraxxus. They sell various things as well, but the main things being the Animated Radius, part of a secret pet, the Memory of Rattle of the Maw, a mostly useless legendary that causes a maw rat to spawn and explode on corpses, and a mount, Lured Bloodtusk, and for Necrolord only, 2 back transmog pieces. This is a new thing to reps in Shadowlands, special back transmog items that require a Covenant and rep in order to use. The Paragon Cache has a chance at a pet, toy, and a mount. The first time mounts were returned to the Paragon Cache since Legion. Now onto the realm of Ardenwald with the Wild Hunt. Again, gained by doing content in Ardenwald. You can then buy from them Flufa, the Crane Soul if you're a Night Fae, the Memory of Eonar, a healer legendary, and their respective cosmetic transmog back pieces. The Paragon Cache has a chance at a pet and another mount. And now for the final zone, Revendreth, with the Court of the Harvester. They sell the usual pets, mounts, and toys, as well as a legendary Memory of Norgannon, which allows you to cast while moving temporarily. The usual transmog back pieces specific to the Covenant, and the Paragon Cache only having a chance to obtain 1 pet. Now, it would be that simple, but we have some more reps to go over, as there are secondary reps that are not gained by specific world quests in Shadowlands. First, we have the Stitchmasters. This reputation is for Necrolords only, and comes from doing quests with your crafted abominations from the Abomination Factory. These weekly quests give you rep, and while it has no Paragon, the rep allows you to buy 1 single thing. The Arsenal Stitchmaster's weapons. This is bought from Clyde using Anima Touch weapon fragments, found from searching for artifacts with Chordy, or a chance from a weekly quest bags from the Abominations. The Court of Night is reputation focused on the Night Fae, but can be gathered by any Covenant player, just much harder, as Night Fae players can get it by doing content with their Sanctum, killing rares, collecting treasures. However, non-Night Fae players can still get this rep, but they can only get it from killing a specific rare summoned by Night Fae. The rewards are Stemmons, Willow Breeze, pets, as well as the Umbral Scythehorn and the Winterborn Runestag mount. And for Night Fae only, 2 new soul shapes and 2 transmog back pieces as well as armor transmog sets. The next reputation is for the Night Fae only rep that can actually only be earned by the Night Fae. Marasmius, also from the Sanctum, the players can gain rep with the Mushroom Network by doing content for them, and by doing so they get access to some companions, a few mounts, and some transmog back pieces. Next we have the Avowed. This rep is gained by doing Halls of Atonement dungeon and doing various things like killing mobs near the Hall of Atonement dungeons, but out in the open world. They sell some recipes, some pets, and some zone-specific items, and a few things where Venthyr only players, like cosmetic back pieces. Next, we have the Venthyr specific reputation, the Ember Court. This rep is gained by doing the Ember Court event from the Venthyr Covenant Sanctum upgrade, and doing so allows them to buy some upgrades for the Ember Court, an armor set, as well as a couple of mounts and pets and toys. And speaking of the Ember Court and the old friend reputation system, many followers and allies found around the Shadowlands come to the Ember Court to party and relax, and all of them come with their own friendship reputation bar. But none of them really have any actual rewards, so it's just a whole bunch of reps you can grind out for completionist's sake. And that's it for reputations. Now let's go over a couple of reputation related things. First up is ways players can boost reputation gains. The Darkmoon Fair allows players to gain a 10% rep buff from either their Wii buff from riding the carousel or roller coaster, or by using the Darkmoon Top Hat, which can be bought for tickets. The Holiday Hollow's End also allows you to gain the Unburdened or Grim Visage, increasing rep gains by 10%. Or if you play during Pilgrim's Bounty, you gain a 10% bonus rep with Spirit of Sharing. The level 3 Trading Post gives the players an additional 20% extra Draenor rep. The Guild Battle Standards give varying reputation bonuses, however, only from killing monsters and not from quests or anything else. 5% for green, 10% for the blue one, and 15% for the purple. The Diplomacy Racial for Humans, the only racial that has never been changed in the history of WoW. This racial is quite special as it gives the players a 10% bonus rep to everything, making humans the race to pick if all you care about is farming reps. Next is the special events that increase rep. First off, we have the World Quest Weekly event, which increases the rep gain by 50% for any world quest during that week. Another thing is with the end of Battle for Azeroth, we got new additions to Time Walking, a cool little benefit where when Time Walking is active, any reps for that expansions are gained 50% faster. Need to get your Nether Drakes? We'll just wait for the Burning Crusade Time Walking and get it in no time. And speaking of Time Walking, with the introduction of Time Walking, we also got the Time Walking vendors to do with these specific expansions. And these vendors sell mounts, pets, toys that are themed around the expansion, bought using currency earned from Time Walking. But another thing you can buy with this is reputation tokens. Now I could go over all of them, but instead I'll just show you some of them from the one that was up when I was getting footage for this video. Now for the special rewards for reps. First off, there's a couple of achievements for specific amounts of Exalted reps. 40 reps at Exalted gives you the Exalted title. 60 reps gives you the Beloved, and 100 reps gives you the Pure Heart Courser mount and the Esteem title. Now we'll go over the rest of them super quick. United Nations gained by having your guild gain 55 unique reps to Exalted unlocks the Dark Phoenix Hatchling pet from the guild vendor, the same place you buy the before mentioned battle standards. Guardian of Sonaris for getting Exalted with Cenarian Circle and Expeditions gets you Guardian of Sonaris title. The Argent Champion title from the achievement of the same name from the Exalted Argent Dawn and Argent Crusade. The Diplomat for getting Exalted with the Timbermaw Hold, Sporgar, Kuranai, Maghar gets you the Diplomat title. Ambassador of the Horde or Alliance for having Exalted with all of the base races gets you the Ambassador title. The Ashen Verdict Exalted grants the Ashen Verdict title. And Exalted with the Avengers of Hyjal grants you the Avengers of Hyjal title. Exalted with the Tillers grants you the Farmer title. And becoming a Pandaren Ambassador by being Exalted with all of the base Pandera factions grants the Pandaren Kite String. Being Exalted with the Laughing Skull Orcs gives you the Mass Chuckler. Exalted with the Shatari Defense gives you the Peacekeeper. The Frostwolf Orcs gives you of the Frostwolves. The Council of the Exarchs gives you the Prelate. Vol'jin Spear gives you the Spear of Vol'jin, while Rim's Vanguard gives you the Sword of Rin. The Steam Weedle Preservation gives Conservationists. The Mantle of the Talon King gives a special Talon Guard Correct Follower, as well as the Talon King or Queen title. The Savage Friends achievement gives the Trading Post Level 3 Blueprint. Chromie Homie gives the Time Lord title. And the Fisher Friend of the Isles gives the Underlight Emerald Artifact appearance for the Fishing Artifact. Oh, and Insane in the Membrane, a feat of strength that grants the Insane title. This achievement requires you to have reached Honored with the Bloodcell Buccaneers, and Exalted with Booty Bay, Everlook, Gadgetzan, Ratchet, Darkmoon Fair, and Ravenhold. This one once required Chandalar, but was eventually removed from the requirements.
In this video, we'll be talking about the item Hearthstone from World of Warcraft and not the card game Hearthstone, which is made by the same company. The Hearthstone is the very first item you will ever obtain, as well as the most important item in everyone's bag. This item, for those of you who don't know, when used and after a long cast time, teleports you to your home inn, but you can set anywhere you wish as long as there's an innkeeper there to accept your hearth. Originally, this item had a 1-hour cooldown, an insane thing by today's standard, but that was vanilla for you. It kinda just fit in with everything else. Something many people don't know is that wherever you stand, and whatever direction you're facing when you set your Hearthstone, is where you will appear when you actually hearth. So in some places you could even set your Hearthstone outside the building if the innkeeper was close enough to the wall. allowing you to mount up right away. While the Hearthstone can be deleted, simply speaking to an innkeeper and setting your Hearthstone there will spawn a new one for you. The Hearthstone seems like quite a powerful object, something you simply use that teleports you home, so surely that would solve all kinds of problems in lore. So, with that, it must be purely a mechanical thing and not a real item in lore, right? Well, no actually. There was multiple times they are used and referenced. In the novel Stormrage, they are said to be very rare. King Varian himself only believed them to be a legend. Tyrande and Brawl also used them to retreat to Darnassus after the attack on Stormwind by the Nightmare. However, Tyrande had to cancel her cast as she was attacked. Later, in The Shattering, the prelude novel to Cataclysm, Jaina gives Anduin a Hearthstone that brings him to her home in Theramore, so he may find more time to have a normal childhood, instead of the politics of Stormwind all the time. This would end up saving his life, as he used it to escape Ironforge after the Dark Iron took control of the city. So, these items do exist in lore, but they are very rare. Although many quests while exploring the world of Azeroth give them to us, as well as every new character being given one from the start. Imagine a game of World of Warcraft where they stuck to lore very hard, and the Hearthstone was some legendary-like item where you needed to spend massive amounts of gold on it, and entire quest lines to unlock. While epic, I'm sure most people would agree how it is now is a much more preferable method, considering the fact it's probably one of the most useful items in the game. Fun fact, the starting location for races, where you appear when you spawn in, is a special location that can never be recovered. The second you change your Hearthstone to a new location, you can no longer go to that old location through a Hearthstone anymore, as the location is set from creating your character and is not a default position. Now, getting back on topic, I'm sure many of you have probably heard of the term called bubble hearthing, but for those of you who don't know, taking damage while casting your Hearthstone interrupts it. However, paladins have an ability called Divine Shield, which allows them to be invincible for some time, and by pairing these together, paladins could pull off the full cast time of a Hearthstone in the middle of combat and leave pretty much any situation, especially before immune breakers were added to the game in TBC. Imagine this, you're in the Maw with war mode on, trying to get bonus Stygia or whatever. You forgot to spend your Stygia and have 10,000 of it on you, but suddenly a rogue has attacked you. Now what do? Well, you cast Divine Shield, and then cast your Hearthstone, and the rogue can do nothing but watch. Well, most of the time, unless there's a passing priest or warrior who pops the bubble for them. Before we move on, there's also the Shaman Astral Recall ability. This spell acts like a second Hearthstone, having a 15-minute cooldown. Insane, right? While the normal player could hearth only once an hour, a shaman could hearth 5 times an hour. There was also 2 glyphs that worked with this ability. Astral Fixation, which when added in Mist of Pandaria, brought you to your capital's Earth Shrine instead of your hearth location. However, it has since been removed with the new glyph system. And also the glyph of Astral Recall in Wrath of the Lich King, which originally reduced its cooldown by 2.5 minutes, but was then quickly buffed to reduce the cooldown by 7.5 minutes instead, which basically cut its cooldown in half, giving shamans one of the shortest Hearthstone times ever. In Mist of Pandaria, it was nerfed to an only 5-minute reduction, and then removed in Legion with the glyph rework. But they did bake its cooldown reduction directly into the ability, so it's still at a 10-minute cooldown to this day. Originally, there was a thing called Ghetto Hearthing that allowed players, through the use of groups and nearby dungeons, to hearth even without a cooldown. As if you were in a dungeon or raid and simply left group, after 1 minute you would be teleported to your Hearthstone location. But with Wrath of the Lich King, Blizzard changed this, making it so when you were kicked from an instance, you would be brought to the closest graveyard instead. And to make up for this, they halved the cooldown of the Hearthstone from 1 hour to 30 minutes, to then only be halved again in Cataclysm with the addition of the guild leveling system, with the ability Hasty Hearth. Although originally your guild had to unlock this ability, when they later removed the guild levels, you now just get it automatically when you join a guild. Now, we could go over every single item and class spell that teleports you from one place to another like a Hearthstone, but that would be insane. So instead, we will only talk about items that work in the same way that the Hearthstone does, teleporting you to a place that you can change the outcome of. And so first, we should talk about the Volpera racial ability, Make Camp. This ability allows you to place a tent somewhere in the open world and even stays visible for some time. And then it will be set as your spawn point. So you can set it anywhere you want, a special rare spawn location, the auction house, the entrance of a raid you farm, whatever and wherever you want. Not whenever you want though, because Return to Camp has a 1 hour long cooldown, so it's a tiny bit longer than the default Hearthstone, but can be used in addition to it, so it's nothing but a plus. There's also the Hearth Kidney Stone, an ability given to players of the Necrolord Covenant who choose the Emini Soulbind and its ability. This is a Hearthstone that can be set separately from your usual Hearthstone, allowing you to have 2 Hearthstone locations at a time. However, it has a 12-hour cooldown, which seems kind of long, right? Well, every killing blow you do while this Hearthstone is on cooldown reduces the cooldown by 5 minutes. Although funny enough, as this Hearthstone is an ability and not an item, bosses that would cast mind controls on players would sometimes choose to use their longest cooldown ability to help them kill their non-controlled allies. But because this is an ability, that made it a choice for this. For example, the final boss of Turnus Scythe, causing mind control players to hearth mid-fight, and sometimes worked with a mage's teleport too, ruining quite a few Mythic Plus keys. Although this was thankfully fixed rather quickly once it became well known. We also got 2 special Hearthstones from the expansions Warlords of Draenor and Legion, the first being the Garrison Hearthstone. This item was granted upon creating your garrison, and acted just like a normal Hearthstone. However, it could not have its location changed, always bringing you back to your garrison, and luckily did not share cooldown with your regular Hearthstone. And the other item, the Dalaran Hearthstone, was granted to you after completing the Legion intro, allowing you to, just like the Garrison Hearthstone, teleports you to one set place that you can't change with a 20-minute cooldown. This time though, teleporting you to the Dalaran floating above the Broken Isles. Next, we'll talk about the items with Hearthstones built into them. First, the Ruby Slippers from Karazhan. These cloth boots are of course based on the Ruby Slippers from Wizard of Oz, and clicking your heels together, these would teleport you to your Hearthstone location. Then in Return to Karazhan and Legion, we had the astonishingly Scarlet Slippers. Just an updated version of the Ruby Slippers, they do the exact same thing. Sad thing to mention is these 2 items shared a cooldown with your Hearthstone, meaning all they did was save a spot in your bags if you didn't want to carry around a Hearthstone, and instead wore these as gear. However, the Montebank's Colorful Cloak, a cloak which dropped in the Operation Megagon Mega Dungeon, had a Hearthstone built into it, but it did not share the cooldown with your Hearthstone, instead having a baseline 1-day cooldown built in, meaning carrying around this item gave you a second Hearthstone, although once a day. We've also had a few consumable Hearthstones over the years in WoW, first being the Scrolls of Recall 1, 2, and 3 from Wrath of the Lich King. These items were made and usable by scribes. With a 20-minute cooldown, these scrolls teleported you to your Hearthstone location and were consumed on use. However, they had one downside. The Scroll of Recall level 1 only worked up to level 40. If you were above level 40, it would instead teleport you to a random location all over Azeroth instead of your Hearthstone location. So once you hit level 40, you needed to use the Scroll of Recall level 2, which worked up to level 70. But yet again, if you were over level 70, it would teleport you to a random location around Azeroth. So you would move on to the Scroll of Recall 3, which worked for anyone level 80 and below, which worked amazingly till Cataclysm came out and we went above level 80 and no new Scrolls of Recalls were added. But it is a fun item to use for alt, I suppose. Or if you just want to have fun and be teleported to a random location in Azeroth. And the next item, called the Scroll of Town Portal, which could be obtained during the Diablo Anniversary event in WoW by killing the Count King or treasure goblins found in Dalaran Sewers or Darkshire, where you can get a lot of these little scrolls, which work just like Scrolls of Recall, just without the level requirements. These scrolls, consumed on use, teleported you to your Hearthstone location, and with no cooldown too. The only thing holding you back was how many you farmed before the event was over. And speaking of the Diablo event and these scrolls, let's move on to the final and biggest part of the video, Hearthstone replacements. Blizzard added quite a few items in WoW that replaced Hearthstones, usually by just giving an item a new name. There was little special about these items at first. However, with Warlords of Draenor and the addition of the toy box, these items all got the toy tag, meaning you no longer had to hold them in your bag and could simply use them from the toy box. Now you could save on inventory slots by simply using one of these Hearthstones and getting rid of the one in your bag. For example, the Tome of Town Portal. This was the tome from the Diablo 20th Anniversary event and was created by using 10 of the town scrolls combined together with a blank book. While the tome itself had no actual unique effect, it was an easy way for players to get a toy Hearthstone, as the only other easy one at the time was the Innkeeper's Hearthstone, a Hearthstone obtained from archaeology, that sometimes, upon hearthing, would cause a dwarf woman spirit to follow you around for a bit. Next, we have the Cosmetic Hearthstones. These Hearthstones are earned in one way or another and actually have a cosmetic effect when casting them, making them quite unique, and a fun way to spice up the usual simple green hand effect that the Hearthstone has. The Headless Horseman's Hearthstone came from the Hollow's End and is bought with tricky treats, And in fact, all of the holiday ones are basically bought with their respective holidays' currencies, like the Lunar Elders Hearthstone, the Love is in the Air Hearthstone, Noble Garden, Midsummer Fire Festival, and Brewfest. The Great Father's Winter Hearthstone, the one for Feast of Wintervale, does not cost any currency and is simply obtained from the gently shaken gifts from under the Wintervale tree. And those are all the holiday Hearthstones. Next, we have the holographic digitization Hearthstone, crafted from the Junkyard Tinker in Mechagon. Then we have the Eternal Traveler's Hearthstone, obtained from buying the Shadowlands Epic Edition, the Dark Portal, a Hearthstone obtained from the TCG pack Betrayal of the Guardian, with a rarity of 1 in 132 booster packs. Also, the Ethereal Portal from the TCG, this time from the Ice Crown expansion, with a 1 in 121 booster pack odds, this being the first ever Hearthstone replacement, and added in Wrath of the Lich King. Lastly, we have the 4 Covenant Hearthstones. These are bought from the respective Covenants and Shadowlands for Anima after reaching Renown 11. In this video, we'll be discussing the changes to WoW's 2 major faction hubs throughout the history of the game. This will be a very broad overview, since there are a ton of very small details from each expansion that can be added, such as which random NPCs were added and removed. With WoW's 9th expansion Dragonflight on the horizon, we'd figured now would be a good time to look back over the changes that both Stormwind and Orgrimmar have undergone over the years. Starting off with Classic WoW. Following the Second War, the Stonemasons Guild, led by Edwin Van Cleef, rebuilt much of Stormwind as it stands today. However, due to King Varian's wife's death at the machinations of the evil Black Dragon Onyxia disguised as Lady Katrina Prestor, the Stonemasons Guild eventually grew disgruntled with Stormwind and formed the Defies Brotherhood. A notable change occurs in the faction capitals when players raid Onyxia's lair or Blackwing lair. Upon the death of one of the children of Deathwing, Onyxia's head or Neferent's head will drop, which starts a quest. After completing the quest, the respective dragon's head will be displayed in a large spike in the central Orgrimmar area, or will be hung from the front gates of Stormwind area for a long period of time, while also giving a buff to all players and NPCs in the major city. The pre-patch event for the Burning Crusade expansion saw Burning Legion forces under High Lord Cruel attack Orgrimmar and Stormwind, with players fighting the demons off before assaulting the Dark Portal. And this is about it, except a bunch of NPC workers and piles of explosives added to one of the canals, leading to the Stormwind Harbor, supposedly already built. However, for some reason, the only thing stopping us from going there is a giant wall. Well, okay then. Anyways, this theme of actually putting NPCs building stuff ahead of it being added is a common thing Blizzard with Orgrimmar and especially Stormwind. WoW's next expansion, the Wrath of the Lich King, allowed players to help repel the Second Scourge invasion. This blight turned the living into the dead, including players, and resulted in massive sieges upon the major cities themselves, which usually led to them being completely overran rather quickly. For transportation and logistical reasons for the war against Arthas, several portals and means of transport to Northrend were added to both Orgrimmar and Stormwind. In Orgrimmar, the Zeppelin Tower to Grommash Hold in the Boran Tundra was built. The Stormwind Harbor was added to the game with the boat in Valiant's Keep and Boran Tundra, and finally with the docks added to Stormwind, Draenei Night Elves no longer needed to run all the way through wetlands, as the boat was added from Darnassus to this new port. Bolvar led the Alliance Assault on Icecrown, and as such, he departed Stormwind at the beginning of Wrath, thankfully replaced with the now returned King Varian Wrynn, who up to this point had been missing, leaving Anduin Wrynn in charge, with Onyxia revealed and kicked out of the city. Wrath also saw the introduction of player Death Knights arriving in Orgrimmar and Stormwind, with much commotion and unease from citizens. Various NPCs are rude and aggressive to DKs when they first arrive in the city from the DK starting zone. Orgrimmar also received a unique arena called the Ring of Valor, originally just a giant unique but useless arena that you could look down on but couldn't even enter. But they did at least reuse the building with the Ring of Valor, which was a unique arena with the rising and lowering platforms with flaming walls. However, this arena was removed from the game in Mists of Pandaria because of its wacky nature, although it had been nerfed and temporarily removed before again and again prior to Mists of Pandaria. For the Cataclysm's launch, both capital cities were completely revamped and updated. The Throne of the Elements was added to the northern plateau of Orgrimmar, and the eastern Earth Shrine in the middle of the lake in the northeast corner of Stormwind. This has 6 portals to the Cataclysm zones, Mount Hyjal, Twilight Highlands of Ashir, Deepholm, and Uldum. A portal to Tol Barad is also located nearby in both cities. After Deathwing's defeat, a large part of his corrupted scales from his back can be seen hanging from chains in the back of the city. The massive scales from Deathwing presumably came off of the infamous Spine of Deathwing fight, and can be located behind the Cataclysm Ring of Portals in both of the cities. Players who can wield his staff can acquire the legendary staff Dragonwrath Terragos's Rest. This long questline is associated with the Firelands raid that took many weeks and a lot of skill and dedication. At the end of the questline, the blue dragonflight would spawn in either Orgrimmar or Stormwind. This massive event plays much like the end of the Old War event in Northrend Dalaran, where Ronan shouts his most famous line, The city is phased for roughly half an hour with a massive speech, and a player who obtained the staff can be seen resting on the back of Terragos's spirit with the blue dragons in the air and magic runes in the sky. Unlike Stormwind, Orgrimmar seemed to escape most of Deathwing's ire, with the only casualties being some zeppelins in the Cata trailer. Garrosh made major changes to Orgrimmar shortly before the Cataclysm expansion, expanding it in size and adding to it various districts, while completely overhauling the layout of each district, and their general shapes. For Torrens in the Valley of Wisdom, the area that used to be the throne room was replaced with various Torrent structures. Trolls in the Valley of Spirits were expanded but moved north, closer to the exit, further from the city center, which was probably a hint at Garrosh's hatred for them, and goblins in the Goblin Slums where the trolls once resided. And the Valley of Honor, once small and rather unused, was massively expanded with a huge back entrance that led to Ajara. The entire city was updated with new inns, auction houses, and homes. The Flightmaster and Zeppelins were moved to the central plateau of the city, and Grommash Hold was built overlooking the center of the city. When Deathwing descended upon Orgrimmar's city after his violent exit from Deepholm, he caused extensive damage to Stormwind. The entirety of Stormwind Park was destroyed, leaving nothing but a crater behind. However, this was not the only damage. The clock tower among the structures was covered with char marks from Deathwing's approach, while the gate to Stormwind itself had massive claw marks melted into the stone, even being the login screen itself, which was a visual of Deathwing sitting on the gate itself. Denath's monument was toppled into the moat as well, with only the feet remaining standing on its pedestal. The Stormwind city outskirts was added, comprising the earthen earth shrines and the field of the northeast part of Stormwind. A massive graveyard was also added, one that contains various tombs and graves, one obviously to Tivin, while some are left more mysterious, one even theorized to be Arthas. Stormwind Keep itself was also updated, finally having an actual throne room, moving the PvP stuff as well as PvE vendors to a new section of the Old Town, finally replacing the god-awful PvP area originally set there. There were even different stone paths made for each district. All of these updates had been sorely needed for both of the cities, since beforehand they were horribly aged facades of 2D walls and massive world holes. Cataclysm introduced Azeroth Flying, which was one of the primary reasons the zones had to be redone. WoW's fourth expansion, Mist of Pandaria, saw a handful of changes to Stormwind and massive changes to Orgrimmar. Unsurprisingly, portals to the Vale of Eternal Blossoms were added in each capital. Mist of Pandaria was a very lore-heavy expansion, but will try to keep the major character actions short. Jaina appears briefly in Stormwind following the destruction of Theramore, but leaves after the Alliance refuses to seek immediate retribution for Theramore. In the events of Mist of Pandaria, Anduin goes missing for a bit while he's presumably lost in Pandaria. This is reflected by his absence in Stormwind Keep, and the start of Varian's search for him sees an Alliance gunship looming in the northeast quarter of Stormwind, where it is ready to take players to Pandaria. Further updates to Stormwind and Mist of Pandaria included the Stormwind entrance towers and the clock tower being restored in 5.2. Additionally, Denath's statue was returned to its former splendor, alongside most of the other superficial damages the Deathwing caused in the Valley of Heroes. The Siege of Orgrimmar shows even more of what Garrosh had been building since before Cataclysm, with enormous underground facilities and rooms. The second half of the raid takes place entirely in front of the city and its outskirts. Garrosh had built up Orgrimmar's defenses, and players had to forge their way through his true horde. We could spend a whole video talking about all the changes in places under Orgrimmar that this raid added, but the actual changes to a capital is one of the reasons this raid is so fondly remembered. This expansion had also recruited the Pandaren, and pandas had joined the faction capitals with their riding turtles and hot air balloons. In Orgrimmar, the Hojin Pandan, led by G. Firepaw, make their camp in the north valley of the city. And in Stormwind, the Tushui Pandaren, led by Asa Cloudsinger, established a camp near the eastern Earth Shrine overlooking the waterfall. Lastly, the Brawlers Guild was also added, an arena that lets players fight various foes from the past, and many joke characters and encounters that wouldn't fit in a raid or a dungeon. These were added to the underside of the Deepran Tram in the Alliance side, and for the Horde it was added where the Ring of Valor stood, once and for all removing it from the game. The Warlords of Draenor expansion saw very few changes to Orgrimmar and Stormwind. Of course, portals to Ashran were added to both cities for players' conveniences and in-game logistics. In Stormwind, a small Kirin-Tor encampment with a portal added on a plateau overlooking the Mage Quarter was added, which can be seen at the end of the Everbloom dungeon. WoW's 6th expansion, Legion, began with the armies of Azeroth amassing and preparing for an assault on the Broken Shore. Both Orgrimmar and Stormwind harbors were full of NPCs and teeming with activity. The Legion starting quest has the players go through the harbor and interact with some of these NPCs. This remains to date one of the most impressive things Blizzard has ever done in sheer scope and build-up for an endgame event. Blizzard also added a new portal to the Broken Isles version of Dalaran to both cities. The major character events in Orgrimmar and Stormwind during Legion included Vol'jin dying after the failed Broken Shore assault, and Sylvanas Windrunner replacing him as Warchief. King Varian Wrynn dies at the Broken Shore, and Anduin takes his place as king. A memorial to Varian is built in finally a rebuilt Stormwind Park, and it is renamed to Lion's Rest. Finally, Illyria and Turalyon returned to Stormwind after the end of Legion. Legion also saw the introduction of allied races to the game. Embassies were built in both Orgrimmar and Stormwind to accommodate these new factions. The Orgrimmar Embassy was added to the southwest corner of Orgrimmar, replacing the Goblin Slums, and the Stormwind Embassy was added to the Stormwind city outskirts, in the north-central part of the city. The Horde welcomed 2 new allied races, the Nightborn led by Thorystra, and the High Mountain Tauren led by Myla. The Alliance gained 2 new allied races, the Void Elves led by Magister Umbric, and the Lightforged Draenei from Argus. Battle for Azeroth included a great many deal of changes to both Orgrimmar and Stormwind, the most notable of these changes being the addition of the portal rooms. There were so many portals throughout the cities from past expansions and patches that were somewhat haphazardly placed. It was high time Blizzard consolidated some. Although they didn't move all the portals and remove some entirely, it was still a major change and a great quality of life update. Officially, the Orgrimmar portal room is called Pathfinder's Den, and the Stormwind portal room is named the Wizard's Sanctum. Various NPCs can be seen running through the portal rooms. Among these NPCs, there are the Exodar Adventurers, Outland Adventurers, Northrend Adventurers, Broken Isle Adventurers, Kulturan Adventurers, and Shadowland Adventurers. Warboards were also added to both cities, which are now ubiquitous in the game and were another great quality of life update. Following the Siege of Lordaeron, Orgrimmar is now full of undead refugees following the destruction of Undercity. The Zeppelin that used to travel to the towers outside of Undercity has been replaced by a portal. The Horde welcomed 3 new allied races to the Orgrimmar Embassy, the Volpera, the Maghar Orcs, and the Zandalari Trolls led by Queen Talanji. These new races and NPCs can be seen throughout the city. By the end of BFA, the Horde had been seriously shaken up. Sylvanas had fled, Sourfang had died, and Gallywix had gone AWOL. In response to the wake of the 2 bad war chiefs, the Horde Council was established, with Gazlo now leading the Bilgewater Cartel, and Kalia Menethil and Lillian Voss now leading the Forsaken. We'll briefly go into more details about the Orgrimmar Portal Room. The portal room consists of 2 levels and was added in patch 8.1.5. Many of the portals that were moved or deleted were formerly located in the Cleft of Shadow, located underneath Orgrimmar. The first level of Orgrimmar portal room consisted of 7 portals encaved in almost perfect circle. However, only 6 of them are used. Down 3 flights of stairs in the basement level, an exact copy of the previous level and layout, but with only 3 portals active out of the 7 available spaces. Every portal has 2 casters holding it open, and there are some interesting choices Blizzard has made as to who is casting them. This Silvermoon portal is created by 2 Blood Elf Silvermoon Magisters. In Shadowlands, the Oribos portal was added and is held up by Ebonblade Alkalites. The portal to Azuna is held open by 2 Nightborn Shal'Dorai Arcanists. The portal to Zuldazar is held open by 2 Zandalari Tro Arcanitals. The portal to the Jade Forest is held open by 2 Pandoran Haujin Magisters. The portal to Northrend Dalaran is held open by 2 Undead Argent Mages. The portal to Shatrath is held open by 2 Ethereal Consortium Arcanists. The portal to the Caverns of Time is held open by 2 Bronze Chronomancers, presumably 2 Bronze Dragons in the form of Blood Elves. And the portal to War Spear is held open by 2 Maghar Orc Priests. The Cavern of Time portal was added in 8.2, and the other 2 portals were moved down from the floor above. In Stormwind, a boat was added to Borealis from the harbor. The boat to Darnassus was replaced by a portal following the burning of Teldrassil, and Worgen and Night Elf refugees are now present in Stormwind with their old home being destroyed. A lot of lore events take place in Stormwind throughout BFA, but Talanji being rescued from the Stormwind Stockades by a Horde champion sets off a lot of the events of BFA. Right after this, Jaina sets off for Kul Tiras to face her past and secure a navy. Additionally, while not seen in the game, but rather cinematic, Saurfang is imprisoned in the Stormwind Stockades until Anduin releases him. The Stormwind Harbor can also be seen full of dead soldiers in the cinematic. During and after the events of the Fourth War, the Alliance gained 3 new allied races: the Kulturan humans, the Dark Iron Dwarves, and the Mechanomes. The Stormwind Portal Room, like its Horde counterpart, has so much detail that can't be described in this video, but we'll try to keep it short. The Stormwind Portal Room is a much more grand, spacious, and accommodating than its Orgrimmar counterpart. It features an entrance hall and a much easier linear layout with 10 portal slots and a set of 2 wings with a large stained glass window and a future set of stairs in the center of the long room. The portal room is guarded by several summoned water elementals and arcane golems. Upon entering the portal room, ascending the Mage Tower in the Mage Quarter in Stormwind, to the right in a clockwise faction are portals to Stormshield, powered by 2 Kirin Tor mages. After that, there's a portal to Borealis at the far left end of the wing, held up by 2 Kulturan human Stormwake Tide Sages. In Shadowlands, the Oribos portal was added and is held open by 2 Ebonblade Alkalite human Death Knights. And the 5th and final portal of the left leads to Azuna, and is held open by 2 Night Elf Narthalas Ghost Mages. In the right wing, once again clockwise from the entrance, are the portals to the Northrend Dalaran, powered by 2 Silver Covenant Mages. To the right of the portal is the portal to the Exodar, powered by 2 Draenei Portal Keepers. A portal to the Caverns of Time at the far end of the right wing, held open by 2 Bronze Chronomancers. Next, a portal to Shatrath that is held open by 2 ethereal consortium arcanists. And finally, a portal to the Jade Forest held open by the Pandoran Tushui Magisters. There were a few interesting notes about these NPCs in the portal rooms, which is why they're listed here. There were only 2 NPCs of the same faction from the open portals in both Orgrimmar and Stormwind, which are the Ethereals and the Bronze Dragons. Curiously, all of the NPCs which are opening the portals can be played by characters, with the only exceptions being the Ethereals, the Ghosts, and the Bronze Dragons. Perhaps these are hinting at future races which might be added to the game. Although, fun fact, during the beta of Shadowlands, brokers held the portal to Oribos open. However, during the beta they were removed and replaced with the Ebon Blade. Shadowlands saw a few changes to Orgrimmar and Stormwind. During Death Rising, the pre-patch event, Anduin was abducted by Mossworn from Stormwind and Turalyon now rules in his absence. Chromie time was also implemented, and the Bronze Dragon Chromie can now be found near the NPCs in both cities. The new leveling system can be activated by talking to her on top of her hourglass. Finally, new character introduction buildings were added in Shadowlands with a level squish. These buildings originally were used by various random vendors, but are now replaced by buildings simply called training halls, and are full of class trainers that players ascend to after finishing Exile's Reach, the new island starting zone. A portal to Oribos was added in both cities' portal rooms, and finally in 9.1.5, weather effects were added to capital cities, including rain and thunder, which really are a wonder to see when they happen. There is also a new little structure in 9.2.5 PTR, which looks like a stable with various workers preparing the location. Maybe a stable for our new customizable dragonfly mounts? It even includes a short questline where you stop lazy workers and thieves by throwing pies at them. Stormwind is beside the stockades, and Orgrimmar's is sitting in the Valley of Strength where the guild vendor used to be. It now moved to the outer edge, with even more changes seemingly on the way for the new expansion Dragonflight, like a possible update to both cities' docks. But we will have to see when the future comes in Dragonflight. During the expansions of the Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King, we had a system called badges. Badges were quite nice and allowed players to passively earn gear to buy equal to current raid tier. However, with the expansion Cataclysm, they tried to shuffle this up with the reworking of the badge system into the Valor system. Cataclysm had 2 currencies used to buy gear: Valor, which came from the current raid or your first daily heroic dungeon, and was used to buy a large variety of raid gear. And also a secondary currency, Justice, which was obtained by doing older Cataclysm raids and also random heroic dungeons. There was also a funny little part in this that Emblems of Frost and Emblems of Triumph from Wrath of the Lich King expansion also became Justice points, and these points were used to buy gear from vendors who previously sold them for badges. And later, as more raids were added to Cataclysm, older raids were converted to this as well, meaning a player who saved their badges from Wrath of the Lich King could actually use them to buy gear from the Firelands vendor. That is, if they waited until Dragon Soul at least. But enough about Justice points, this video is about Valor. Valor points were limited on how much you could earn per week, as you got some for doing your daily heroic and some for defeating bosses on 10 and 25 man each week. And as in Cataclysm, you were limited to doing one or the other 10 or 25 man mode for that week. So if you wanted the most Valor, you had to do 25 man. Heroic too, as Bastion of Twilight had an extra boss on Heroic, meaning more Valor. Then with patch 4.1, they added the Rise of the Zandalari dungeons, and completing a random one of these each day on Heroic granted even more Valor. Then in patch 4.2, we had the Firelands, and with that we had our first Valor point reset. All previous Valor points were just turned into Justice points, and with it, all previous Valor gear was made available for Justice points. But at the same time, old content still gave Valor points though. Meaning if you wanted that sweet new gear, you could get extra Valor by grinding old content in the form of the Daily Heroic, Daily Zandalari Heroic, and the Heroic modes of the previous raid tiers. But not their normal modes, as those didn't give Valor anymore. But all the modes of the new Firelands raid did. So this is a lot of stuff for Valor, but it was well worth it. You could buy all sorts of gear, including tier gear, at least normal versions anyway, and being able to guarantee a full set of normal mode gear after a while, with no worry of RNG or killing specific bosses, was pretty amazing. But sadly, well, something I forgot to mention was before this there was a weekly cap of 1250, which meant you could buy a piece of gear pretty much every week really easily. However, with the Firelands, they reduced this cap to 980, meaning it could take anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks to get the item you wanted now. And then with patch 4.3, they raised this to a simple 1000, which was still lower than its original cap. And of course, also with 4.3 and the new Dragon Soul raid came another Valor wipe, meaning you needed to do the new raid to get the most Valor, but could still grind old raids for Valor if you wanted in the heroic modes. They also made it so 10 and 25 man modes drop the same amount of Valor. Also in 4.3, they introduced the Raid Finder system, and with this, Blizzard felt that with more ways to kill bosses meant more ways to get tier gear, causing them to just remove tier gear from the Valor vendor, leaving it really only with off pieces and trinkets, and removing a lot of the previous options that players did have with Valor. This change, on top of the new easy mode looking for raid, did not sit well with the player base, as being able to guarantee, after a couple of weeks, being able to buy whatever you wanted was quite nice, a bonus on top of the randomness of raid loot, to then having to roll for it against players. Then on to Mist of Pandaria, yet another reset happened, moving all old Valor into Justice. It still held the weekly cap of 1,000, but it reduced the original 4,000 total cap of Valor down to 3,000. However, they did add a new buff called Valor of the Ancients. This buff activated when you reach the 1,000 weekly Valor cap, and once activated would appear in all of your alts on the realm for the week, giving them a 50% increase Valor gain, allowing you to get Valor on your alt or two at double the speed compared to your main, or 50% the speed. And where did you get the Valor? Well, for your Pandaria, you got them from daily quests, daily challenge mode quests, heroic dungeons, raid bosses, raid finders, scenarios, and completing challenge modes in gold, silver, or bronze. And one other thing different was the gear you could buy did not have a simple Valor cost. It also had a reputation requirement, which meant you needed to do a lot of dailies to not only get Valor, but to get the revered rep required to buy the gear from the respective faction. Luckily, this is also when Blizzard removed the 25 daily quest limit, so you could do as many dailies as you wanted, although it ended up being a massive drain on players' time. And so in another hotfix shortly after, they reduced the requirement of some of the Valor gear from revered to just honored, making it a lot less dailies required. But that's not all. The Valor was used in most of Mist of Pandaria. All gear, be it dungeon, raid, or Valor gear, could be upgraded, increasing the eye level by 4 each upgrade, and each item could be upgraded twice. But then in patch 5.4, this was changed to be upgraded 4 times, but only for the new gear from the new raid Siege of Orgrimmar. You could even buy Valor points directly from the Thunder Isle and Timeless Isle, but these were limited as well to how much you could even buy each week. And well, then in Warlords of Draenor, Valor was removed. Or for a short time anyway. In patch 6.2, it got re-added, however, now renamed to just Valor, instead of Valor points. This new Valor no longer had a weekly cap, so you could earn as much as you wanted, and well, it was not used to buy any gear. Instead, it was simply used to upgrade gear from the final raid, Hellfire Citadel, or upgrade crafted gear by up to 10 item levels. And you obtained Valor just like in the past, with your random heroic dungeon of the day, mythic dungeons, doing some raids, or completing some weekly bonus events, which you could use to purchase an upgrade for your legendary ring if you really wanted to as well. While Valor stayed for the rest of Warlords of Draenor and all of Legion, it really had no use, as it only worked on Warlords of Draenor gear. So while technically in the game in Legion, it wasn't a viable thing. And finally with BFA, they removed it, even though it would not be till Shadowlands it would be used again. In the first minor patch of Shadowlands in 9.0.5, it was re-added to the game. It was treated entirely different than any of its past versions. While it could be used to upgrade gear like in Pandaria and Warlords of Draenor, it was slightly different. See, in Cataclysm it was used to buy gear, in Mist of Pandaria it was used to buy gear and upgrade gear by 8 and then 16 item levels. Then in Warlords of Draenor it was used to upgrade gear by 10 item levels, but in Shadowlands it upgraded all gear that is obtained for Mythic Plus at least to a set number. Mythic Plus gear can be upgraded all the way from 184 to 200 with the simple cost of Valor, then upgraded to 207 if the player completed all dungeons on at least level 5 or higher within the time limit. And then if they did all 10s in time, you can upgrade them to 213, and then if they do all 15s on time, they can upgrade it all the way up to 220. Instead of in the past, where an 180 item level piece would only become 190 item level, and couldn't get to the real cap of the tier at 210. Nowadays, that 180 could be upgraded all the way up to 220, and that made balancing far different for the system, and overall a lot more useful, as instead of acting as a slight buff to all of your gear, it instead allowed you to upgrade some of your weakest slots by farming items for that slot. Although you could do super low dungeons to get an item quickly, to then upgrade it later. It would just cost more Valor to upgrade it overall than if you farmed it at a higher item level. So, it's up to you if you wanted to farm low item level and save up Valor, or farm a high item level and only need a bit of Valor. Now, how could you get Valor in Shadowlands? Well, first off, callings, with a higher quality callings giving more Valor, but the main source being Mythic Plus dungeons, and each dungeon given a lump sum of Valor, no matter how high the key. Again, allowing you to spam low-level keys for tons of Valor. And with the weekly cap returned, although not really a weekly cap, week 1 the cap was 5,000, but the cap did not reset next week. Instead, you could earn 750 more, meaning the new cap was 5,750. And then the week after that, the cap is 6,500. And then after that, 7,250. And then after that, 8,000, and so forth and so forth. So if a player earned 1,000 Valor in the first week, they would be able to earn 4,000 more the next week. And then if they still waited till the next week, they could then be able to earn 4,750. So if they then farmed it all, they would be able to earn 0 more. And then next week, they could earn another 750. The original 2 world bosses were Ziragos and Lord Kazakh. These 2 bosses didn't spawn often, required a full raid group to kill, dropped some of the best loot in the game at the time they were introduced, and were out in the open world, so anyone could attack them. Since this was in the time before shared tagging, only people in the first raid group that tagged the world boss could get a chance at its loot, which made fighting over a world boss part of the world boss. Just trying to kill the world boss with your guild took an enormous amount of effort, especially on PvP servers where the opposing faction could come in and kill your raid group, and then attempt the boss themselves. Or even on PvE servers, people from the same faction would constantly tag kite the boss, so that other people wouldn't have a chance at killing it. Simply being able to kill the world boss took an enormous amount of effort, in addition to world bosses themselves being, a boss fight. So you had mechanics and healers and tanks to do stuff, and DPS checks to meet. Then, before the Encourage event, Blizzard released 4 more world bosses called the Dragons of Nightmare. Just like with the Ziragos and Kazakh, these 4 raid bosses had some of the best gear in the game when they were first released. The 4 dragons spawned around the world near portals in Duskwood, the Hinterlands, Feralis, and Ashenvale. The dragons were also part of the Scepter of the Shifting Sands questline, and they dropped nature resistance gear, which was all but needed for one of the fights in AQ40. So even after better gear was available, guilds would still try to kill these dragons for their nature resistance gear. And these were all of the world bosses added with Classic WoW, and they were pretty popular to an extent. Some guilds didn't bother killing them because it was such a headache just attempting to kill one in the first place, as you had competition from other guilds and the enemy faction could just mess with you. And because of this, world bosses kind of saw a little bit of a change in future expansions. Come patch 2.0, with the Burning Crusade pre-launch event, High Lord Cruel was added as a world boss in place of Lord Kazakh, as kind of a precursor to the Burning Crusade expansion. Once the pre-expansion event ended, High Lord Cruel was removed from the game and didn't make a return until Legion, as he's the boss tank players would have to fight in their Mage Tower challenge, alongside Velen. Then, in the Burning Crusade, there were 2 new world bosses added to Outlands, Doom Lord Kazakh and Doom Walker. These 2 world bosses were just like the ones from Vanilla WoW. They dropped gear on par with the current raid tier when they were added, and guilds had to fight over the chance to fight them. Except since these 2 world bosses were added at the start of the expansion, their gear was only on par with Karazhan, which was the first raid of the expansion. And the gear in Karazhan was barely better than heroic dungeon gear, as when the first bosses were added to Vanilla, they were added kind of towards the middle of the expansion and not at the very beginning, so their gear was actually worth trying to get. Unlike these 2. So as more raids came out, Blizzard did not update the gear on these world bosses, and they also did not add any more world bosses to the expansion. So later on in the expansion, the only people bothering to kill the world bosses were guilds trying to gear up new players, as most established guilds didn't want to deal with the headache required in order to kill the world boss if it wasn't given any good loot. Also in the Burning Crusade, they added Omen, a world boss during the Lunar Festival event. It was basically just part of the quest for the holiday. I'm not really sure it counts as a world boss in the traditional sense, but I will mention it here just in case. And since players weren't exactly clamoring for more world bosses because of the headaches required with trying to kill them, Blizzard just straight up didn't add any world bosses with Wrath of the Lich King. Although instead of world bosses, they did introduce the VOA raids, which is a raid only accessible if your faction won Winter Grasps. So that kind of took the place of fighting over a world boss. Then in Cataclysm, Blizzard didn't add any world bosses, but they did add a series of mini-bosses, which were rare spawns that were tuned to 5-player heroic difficulty, and dropped gear accordingly. Eventually, their gear was buffed to epic quality in patch 4.1, but since these mini-bosses were rare spawns, hardly anyone bothered doing them since the rewards weren't really worth it for how difficult they were to defeat. Well, except for Poseidon's, because that mini-boss dropped a mount. It wasn't until Mist of Pandaria that true world bosses returned to the game, and these new world bosses didn't require you to be in a raid group to share in the loot, as this was one of the first iterations of the personal loot system in the game, and certain hard mobs had tag sharing, a feature that wouldn't be commonplace until Legion. The first two world bosses added with Mists were Galleon and the Shaw of Anger. Both bosses only dropped loot appropriate for the first tier of raiding, keeping in line with the previous world bosses up to this point. But in addition to that, they also both dropped a mount. And since both dropped a mount, people still farm these world bosses to this day, which also meant people continuously killed these world bosses even after their gear was no longer relevant. Basically, just adding a random chance to drop a mount made it so players would keep trying to kill the world boss the entire expansion, without having to increase the item level of the loot. Because there's nothing players love more than getting mounts. Although in the Shaw of Anger's case, the Reigns of the Heavenly Onyx Cloud Serpent had such a low chance to drop that people weren't convinced that it was even obtainable because barely anyone had one. So Blizzard buffed the drop chance a tiny bit, just to let people know you could actually get this mount. And funny enough, the Shaw of Anger was treated as a rare elite until patch 5.2 when it finally received its boss tag. In patch 5.2, 2 more world bosses were added to the game. Undasta was a world boss added to the Isle of Giants, and available to anyone who wanted to kill it on a reasonable spawn timer. But, with a twist, they actually made Undasta kind of hard to kill. For one, Undasta actually had a tank swap ability, and was immune to taunts. So tanks had to fight each other for threats in order to let their stacks fall off. It had a frontal cone that would kill everyone except tanks, so you had to stay behind it at all times. You had a chain lightning beam ability, which meant you couldn't stack, and had to stay spread out, otherwise he would do a crap ton of damage to the entire raid if you were too stacked up. He did an AoE roar, which would interrupt spellcasters, which made it difficult for healers to heal, and it would gain 10% extra damage over time. So, if the fight lasted too long, his AoE roars would just start one-shotting the raid. And because of the difficulty of Undasta, it was pretty common for there to be a ton of skeletons in the area where you find Undasta, and some of the strategies for killing him involved just kiting him nearer the graveyard so people could resurrect and get back to the fight quicker. Undasta was such a hard world boss that Blizzard just straight up cut its health in half, in order to get players an easier time with it. And they also moved the graveyard closer to the boss, so people wouldn't kite it towards the beach. And since Undasta also dropped a mount, people still killed the boss until the end of the expansion, even after the gear stopped being relevant. As you may have noticed by this point, their gear has only ever been good for the tier in which they were introduced. The other world boss added with 5.2 was Nalik. Now, it was located on the Isle of Thunder, basically right next to the entrance of Throne of Thunder. Unlike Undasta, Nalik was not a difficult world boss. He was pretty standard like all the others. Only required one tank and had reasonable mechanics like just spreading out and healing through AoEs. And just like Undasta, he dropped a mount as well, and gear appropriate for the normal Throne of Thunder. Mist of Pandaria really liked trying to put mounts on world bosses, and you can't really blame him. This made it so people farm these all the way until the end of the expansion. In fact, many people still farm all of these guys once a week even today. Come patch 5.4, Blizzard added 5 new world bosses to Mist of Pandaria. With the addition of the Timeless Isle, Blizzard added 5 world bosses to the island. 4 of them were the August Celestials, and you can only fight one of them at a time. But, despite the fact that there's 4 of them, you can only receive loot from one of them per week. And if you receive loot from one of them, you would not receive loot from the other 3. So, you only had to kill one of them per week in order to get their loot. And these world bosses did not drop a mount. The 5th world boss on the Timeless Isle was Ordos, who was located on a mountain on the Timeless Isle, which you can only get to if you had the legendary cloak equipped. In which case, you'd get a gust of wind which would take you over a broken bridge to his little mountain. And with this requirement, Ordos was the only world boss which required an item in order to access it, giving it a little bit of a soft attunement requirement, as pretty much anyone who played Mist of Pandaria would naturally get the legendary cloak, unless they were just really lazy. Although that was only true during Mist of Pandaria, today it's no longer possible to get the legendary cloak, but the legendary cloak is still required in order to fight this boss, to the chagrin of many people who didn't play during the expansion. With the launch of Warlords of Draenor, there was a promised fungal whale world boss with a lot of the early promotional materials, but it was never added nor seen in game, despite the fact that there is a gigantic underwater zone of the fungal sea, very much in the game. It was just never used for anything, besides like 1 or 2 odd quests. Also, during Warlords Beta, there was a world boss Hydra in the Spires of Iraq, but once the game went live, the boss was turned into a rare elite that didn't drop any kind of special loot, just a few crafted materials and Apexis crystals. And with the launch of WoD, there was no world bosses in the game, until a little bit later after launch, when they added Drove the Ruiner and Tarlna the Ageless, 2 world bosses that spawned in Gorgron and would alternate weeks in which they would spawn, so you can never fight both of them in the same week. Then, 2 months later on, another world boss was added with Rukmar. This world boss would just fly around the Spires of Iraq, and unlike the other 2, this one actually dropped a mount, which meant it was killed much more than the other 2, and is still killed by players to this day. All of these world bosses gave gear roughly equivalent to the first tier of raiding, but I guess luckily for WoD, there was only 2 tiers of raiding, so when the next tier came out, they added another world boss in the Tannan Jungle, who was a homage to one of the very first world bosses ever. And that of course was Supreme Lord Kazak. This is Kazak's 3rd time being a world boss, as he was also a world boss in both Vanilla and TBC. Now, none of the world bosses in Warlords of Draenor were particularly difficult. Blizzard was afraid of adding difficult world bosses after what happened with Undasta. So once their gear stopped being relevant, only Rukmar was killed regularly. Then in Legion, Blizzard changed how world bosses work significantly, and made them much more pug-friendly, to the point where it is kind of just an easy way to get a raid-appropriate piece of loot for the current tier of raiding. As with Legion, they added many world bosses to the game, but with the caveat that you could only kill one of them per week, and the one that you could kill was random. And with the new form of Group Finder being in the game at this point, you could just go to the world boss's location, look in the Group Finder for a raid, and just get the kill very easily, as almost none of the world bosses had difficult mechanics like Undasta. World bosses in Legion were more like weekly quests than they were the semi-difficult mini-encounters that they were for the past few expansions, and nowhere near like the world bosses from Vanilla or TBC. And keeping in line with all the past expansions, once the next tier of raiding came out, the gear these world bosses dropped basically became irrelevant as it wasn't updated. Except for Wither Gem. Wither Gem was a world boss which dropped a trinket called the Arcana Crystal, which had such overinflated stats that people were still farming Wither Gem until the very last tier of raiding in Legion, because it was just so good. In fact, the Arcana Crystal was so good that Blizzard basically made a promise to never make a trinket as good as the Arcana Crystal was, because they didn't want people to keep farming Wither Gem for his gear when it was no longer relevant. Although that's not to say they didn't add more world bosses. With the next tier of raiding in patch 7.2, they added 4 world bosses to the Broken Isles, which dropped a gear appropriate for the new raid. One of these world bosses, Brutalis, was a raid boss in TBC, with its world boss version not being anywhere near as difficult as its boss fight in the Sunwell. Then, in patch 7.2.5, during the World of Warcraft anniversary event, Blizzard added all of the vanilla world bosses back to the game, with loot equivalent to that tier's normal mode, and all of it basically just being updated versions of their vanilla counterparts. There was the 4 Dragons of Nightmare, Aziragos, and Lord Kazak. And so far, with each anniversary since, Blizzard has added these world bosses back to the game with that anniversary event, with them giving gear appropriate for lower tiers of the current raid tier, and as a way to get time walking currency. So it's not cutting edge gear like they were back when they were first released, but it is decent gear for alts. Then in patch 7.3, with the new raid tier, Blizzard added an evasion events, which had a world boss located inside of them, which acted exactly like world bosses, but
They weren't really called world bosses. They would each require a full raid group to complete, and they would give gear appropriate for that tiers of raiding, which you could only loot once a week. Basically, world bosses, just world bosses with their own rooms. So I guess they could be more considered like one boss mini raids to an extent, since you don't technically kill them out in the open world, but you do have to find their rooms out in the open world. I doubt too many people would disagree with me calling them world bosses though. Then with BFA, Blizzard continued with their Legion versions of world bosses, in that they would cycle once per week to a different one, and once a new raid tier came out, their gear did not upgrade with that raid tier. They also added world bosses to the Warfront zones, so whenever you have access to that zone for the week, you get one extra world boss to kill on Arathi Highlands or Darkshore.
First, let's discuss the backpack. While the backpack can be thought of as a bag, unlike bags that cannot be moved, deleted, replaced, or have a particular type of item be specified to it, like how other bags can be specified to be only consumables, equipment, or trade goods. The backpack had 16 slots by default from the very beginning of WoW all the way until the end of Legion. In patch 7.3.5, Blizzard decided to give players 4 extra backpack slots if they enabled an authenticator and an estimate protection for their account. This brought the total number of backpack slots up to 20 for players who had enabled 2-step protection for their accounts. While this promotion was presumably put in place to curtail hacking of accounts, the backpack change did cause some minor controversy since it was an exclusive feature for only 2-factor accounts. A short while later, in patch 9.1.5, the backpack had its icon updated to a higher res quality. The Volpera allied race added in patch 8.3 has a special passive racial ability named Alpaca Saddlebags, which allows Volpera characters to have access to 8 additional slots for the basic backpack. This ability stacks with the 4 extra bag slots, meaning Volpera have the largest backpack in the game with 28 slots, which is way more than the 20 for any other race. Although Blizzard stated in the past increasing the backpack inventory might break the game, the devs later found ways around it and realized it was not so complicated. With mini bags being around 32 slots at the time of writing this video, hopefully Blizzard will also increase the size of the backpack in the future to make it have at least 32 slots. Volpera players can still have 8 more slots and have a 40 slot backpack if game designers want to keep that specific racial trait too. Now let's move on to talking about bags in World of Warcraft. Bags have only really seen 2 major updates, one at the beginning of Cataclysm and one at the beginning of Warlords of Draenor. The first major change to bags inventory came in Cataclysm with the removal of ammunition from the game. As a consequence of this, all ammo pouches, quivers, and soul bags were removed from the game. These removals had a big impact on the immersion and feel of the Hunter and Warlock class, even though ammo pouches were not exclusive to Hunters since rogues and warriors could also use ammunition for their ranged weapons. Ammo pouches also contained bullets for guns. Quivers contain arrows, unsurprisingly. With the removal of the arrow and ammo mechanics from the game in Cataclysm, this meant the bags no longer needed and they were converted into normal bags. Additionally, Warlocks needed soul bags, also known as shard bags, in order to perform various spells and abilities. In Cataclysm, the soul mechanic was reworked and the soul bags were no longer needed, so they were removed and changed into regular bags. The final bag removed in Cataclysm was the key ring, which might not technically be a bag, but it was essentially just a bag for holding keys. In WoW's early days, a lot of the dungeons and raids and other locations could only be entered via a specific key, usually obtained from a quest. By the end of Wrath, there were so many keys it was getting very hard to find and use a specific one. Cataclysm also removed a lot of the old keys in the old world with the zone and quest revamps, and the devs decided that keeping content locked behind keys was not needed, and subsequently decided to remove many keys from the game. With the very few keys remaining, it made sense that the key ring should also be removed. Cataclysm also saw a couple of quality of life updates to the inventory and bag system. First, a much needed search bar feature was added, which let players easily find items by name instead of having to scrutinize their inventory. The second change was that bags that players looted or bought would now be automatically equipped into a bag slot, rather than going into the player's inventory and requiring the player to manually place the bag into a bag slot. The second set of changes to bags came in the Warlords of Draenor expansion. All of these changes were quality of life improvements that definitely benefited the game. The first of these changes was the quest items no longer appeared in the player's inventory. Quest items took up much needed bag space and could quickly become a nuisance, especially while leveling. The second of these changes was the ability to sort bags by item type and automatically sort the player's inventory. The third change was that items in the player's inventory now had a colored border around them to indicate their quality from poor gray items to legendary orange items. The final major change to bags in the inventory concerns the stack size. For most of WoW's life from Classic to Mists of Pandaria, trade skill materials only stacked up to 20 per bag slot. Warlords of Draenor changed this so that most items stacked up to 200. This theoretically meant 10 times the amount of inventory space. In the Dragonflight expansion, most mats from older expansions will now stack up to 1000. This is again a welcome relief and in theory gives the player 5 times more inventory space than they currently have. With the addition of the reagent bag in Dragonflight, this might even be enough to free up a bag that was previously entirely filled up by crafting reagents. Now we move on to the more analytical and statistical breakdown of bags and the item inventory creep problem. Each new expansion adds new items, crafting reagents, materials, equipment, etc, etc. And with a new expansion every 2 years, those items start to add up fast, and a player's bank can only hold so much. For example, in the Dragonflight Alpha, cooking materials in the Dragon Isles are item numbers in the 173,000s. While of course every item in game does not go into a player's inventory, it just goes to show how much stuff is in WoW, and it's quite mind-boggling. So to make this analysis easier, first let's start by examining the number of bag slots and the total number of bags. When a new bag is added to WoW, it usually has 2 more item slots than the previous bag. Blizzard in the past seems to have tried to add a new bag with 2 extra slots in each new patch, but this was only really the case for a few expansions. Note that the following graph does not include any 16 slot bags or bags lower than 16 slots. This is because the basic backpack was 16 slots all the way up until Shadowlands, so it makes sense to only include the bags that were larger than the backpack when talking about bag size expansions. These graphs also do not show crafting bags, ammo pouches, quivers, or soul bags. The first graph shows that many bags in WoW are clustered between 18 to 22 slots, and that there is a big increased number of bags with 30 slots, which stands at 7. Here's a somewhat similar graph breaking down bags added by expansions. The adjusted value includes removing the bags added during the expansions that aren't meaningful to the game as a whole, that were recycled, or that are too low in slot count to be competitive when they were current content. For example, only Demon Hunters can obtain 2 specific bags, so those 2 bags are removed from Legion's number of new bags added. As mentioned earlier, some bags have changed in different expansions, but to list all of those comparisons would be boring and tedious. Finally, here's a graph breaking down the source of each bag. You can see roughly 39% of all the bags with over 16 slots in the game came from tailors, and the bags that are looted account for roughly 28%. The remaining third of bags come from other means. Before we move on to the final bank selection, let's go a bit over some of the miscellaneous trivia related to various bags. The first bag we'll discuss is Onyxia's Hide Backpack. This 18-slot bag dropped from Onyxia in Classic WoW in one of the first raids in the entire game. In Wrath, when Onyxia's lair was retuned to current content level, the bag was updated in patch 3.2 and became the enlarged Onyxia Hide Backpack, which now had 22 total slots. Also in Wrath, tailors can make the 22-slot Glacial bag. At the end of the expansion, Blizzard decided to heavily nerf the production of this item, and in patch 3.3.3, a 7-day cooldown was placed on creating the Glacial bag. This was presumably done since specialization costs were taken off the cooldown in the same patch. This week-long cooldown is one of the records in game for how long a player must wait until they can make another crafted item. Our next fact is focused on the 3 soul bags Warlocks had until 2010. In Cataclysm, these 3 soul bags were converted into regular bags with the removal of soul shards from the game. The first of these 3 soul bags was the Core Fellcloth bag, which was a 28-slot bag that was made by tailors from recipe dropped in Molten Core. At the very beginning of Cataclysm, this bag kept the same name but was changed to only be an 18-slot regular bag. The soul bag from TBC was called the Abund Shadow bag and also had 28 soul slots. In Cataclysm, this bag was converted into a regular 20-slot bag. The final soul bag was from Wrath and was called the Abyssal bag. This bag was slightly larger than the soul bags before since it had 32 slots. The Abyssal bag was changed to a 22-slot bag when Cataclysm launched. Luckily, the first craftable bag in Cataclysm, the Embersoul bag, also had 22 slots, so Warlocks did not need to buy the new bag if they had the Abyssal bag previously equipped. Demon Hunters are the only class in the game with access to not 1, but 2 bags with over 18 slots. The first bags that Demon Hunters spawn with are called the Demon Hide Satchels with 20 slots. The second bag is the Vile Stalker Skin Pouch, which has 28 slots and is found in treasures in the Demon Hunter only starting zone. There are only 4 bags in the entire game locked behind reputations. The worst one is from Mist of Pandaria called the Royal Satchel. This bag has 28 slots and the player can only buy and learn the recipe after they're exalted with the August Celestials, which is one of the most notorious faction reps the game rep with since so much of it comes from boring repeatable dailies. The final bit of trivia for this section is an achievement. Despite being such an integral part of the game, there is only one achievement related to bags in the entire game. This achievement's name was My Sack is Gigantic, and is obtained when the player buys a gigantic bag for 1200 gold from Pilton Harris, who was a vendor in the World's End Tavern in Lower Shatrath. Her name is an obvious reference to Paris Hilton, and the Blizz devs liked her so much they gave her an even bigger bag to sell in Wrath, which was named the Portable Hole and cost 3000 gold. The name of the achievement was changed to My Storage is Gigantic in patch 9.1.5, which caused some controversy, as many saw it unnecessary, and just a PR show following the completely unprofessional revelations that emerged within the company. Now let's move on to the final section of this video, banks. An initial bank account is free to players and offers 28 slots to store almost any items. Afterwards, players can buy 7 more bag slots, which they can put bags in to increase their bank space. The cost of the bag slots increases with each extra bag slot purchase. The first slot starts at 10 silver, the second 1 gold, the third 10 gold, and the last 4 cost 25 gold each. That means there is a total fee of 111 gold and 10 silver to get all the slots. However, this does not include buying the bags that the player must then add to the bag slots that they just bought. When the player has bought all 7 bag slots, they will earn the achievement Safe Deposit, which is worth 10 points. Orgrimmar is the only city in the game with 4 banks. For comparison, Stormwind only has 2. Northrend Dalaran takes second place for the city with the most banks since it has 3 banks, including the Underbelly. As another interesting aside, unlike a real bank, in WoW you cannot store currency within the bank, only items. Almost currencies are not physical in-game anymore. A currency tab or stash would still be very helpful at the bank, especially for depositing gold as well, since so many players are somehow over the 1 million gold mark. The banks throughout all of WoW are run by some interesting unique NPCs, like the Montagues in Undercity and Glutonia in the Broken Isles Dalaran. There are so many to discuss that we'll make in a top 10 video with these colorful characters in the future. We touched on the reagent bank earlier in the video, but one more detail to note is that the reagent bank contains exactly 98 slots. The reagent bank must also be bought with gold, 100 gold to be precise. Thus, to buy all 7 slots in the reagent bank, the player needs to spend 211 gold and 10 silver. Since Warlords of Draenor, players have been able to craft using materials currently stored in their bank from anywhere in the world without needing to retrieve the items first. Currently in the game, there are 4 ways for players to gain access to their bank without actually being at the bank. We won't include the guild ability Mobile Banking, since that only allows players access to their guild's bank. Since guild banks are so different, we'll cover them separately in a different video. There is only one way for every player to be able to access their bank anywhere in the world. The first step of the first method is to become a champion of your race at the Argent tournament. This will award the player with the Argent Squire companion for Alliance players and Argent Gruntling companion for the Horde players. Next, the player must earn the Crusader title and farm 150 champion seals. Only then can the player buy an Argent Pony Brittle from Dame Evniki Capsulus, who was the Crusader's quartermaster. Using this item gives you the Argent Squire or Gruntling a cute little mount, and the player earns the achievement Pony Up. Now, when the player summons their companion, the companion offers mailbox, trade, and bank services. However, the companion will despawn in 3 minutes and will incur a 4-hour cooldown before you can call on their services again. The Guild Herald and Guild Page also share similar functions, but do not allow access to the player's bank. Another way to gain bank access is to use this sassy Imp toy, which has a 35% drop chance from the Imp Master Valisa in Tannet Jungle. However, the Imp does not always listen to the player, and the bank services is only one of the many services he can provide. In addition to only working in Draenor, the toy has a 1-hour cooldown, so it's not the most ideal form of bank access. The final 2 ways to gain bank access in the open world are through being an engineer and using Jeeves, or being a goblin and using the racial Hobgoblin. Before we wrap up the video, let's briefly touch on Void Storage. Void Storage is similar to the bank, but with several key differences. Only trophies, cosmetic items, and special holiday items can be stored in it. Void Storage costs 10 gold each to deposit an item. Luckily, withdrawing an item from the Void Storage is free. The interface contains 160 slots and 2 tabs and costs 100 gold to open a Void Storage account. The system of long-term inventory management was first implemented in patch 4.3 and was meant to serve as an everlasting storage solution to items players wanted to hold on to as keepsakes, but that were taking up valuable inventory space. The lore behind the Void Storage is that it was invented by the Ethereals, who utilized their technomancy to create an apparatus through which the pocket dimension can be accessed. In World of Warcraft, there's this thing called hard mode bosses, where when you engage with them, you can perform certain triggers during the fight that makes them harder, and gives you a special reward at the end of the encounter for purposefully trying to do them harder. In the early days of WoW, the very first hard mode trigger was in AQ40 with the Silithid royalty. This bug trial was an optional boss in that instance, which coincidentally was also one of the first optional raid bosses in the game, and rewarded different gear depending on which Silithid you killed last, with the best loot being obtained from killing Lord Kree last, which was also the hardest order to kill them in. Now, in vanilla WoW, there was no such thing as heroic or mythic modes. Everyone did the exact same difficulty as everyone else if you entered an instance. So this was the first time players could adjust the difficulty for their group, and either complete it easier or harder depending on whether or not they wanted better gear. And both players and Blizzard liked this idea, so they occasionally brought it back and experimented with it. In Zul'Aman, a raid added in the Burning Crusade, they had a system similar to the timed event in Stratholme, where as soon as you entered the instance, a timer would start, and you had a set amount of time to kill the first 4 bosses before the timer ran out. And if you successfully killed the 4 bosses within the allotted time, better loot was rewarded and you got a mount, the Amani Warbear. Now, this wasn't really a hard mode in the same way as the previous one, as you just beat all the fights like normal, you just killed them quickly and tried to rush their trash if you could. But it was a way of defeating bosses that gave you better rewards, so it kind of counts. Then, in the Sunwell Plateau, the last raid of the expansion, depending on the order you killed the Eredar Dark Twins, you could get better loot. This hard mode trigger was basically the same as the bug trio. You just killed the harder one last and you got better gear. In this case, killing Lady Sacrolash last was the harder of the two, and would yield more gear drops. But then, in a later patch, they kind of removed this kill order, and made it so the twins would drop identical loot regardless of which one you killed first. So essentially, they removed the hard mode, though this change was made after progression was basically done already, so it wasn't a huge deal. Then in Wrath of the Lich King, Blizzard really went all out with hard mode triggers, and the expansion is kind of the golden age of hard modes. In one of the very first raids you could do, the Obsidian Sanctum, if you killed the boss Sartharion with one or more of the Twilight Drakes in the room active, he would drop higher item level loot. And if you left all 3 Drakes alive when you pulled the boss, everyone in the room would also get a mount. So, the way to do the fight the easiest was to go into the room and clear all the trash, killing the 3 Drakes who were each little mini-bosses, which made the fight much more difficult if you had to deal with those 3 mini-bosses during the regular fight. Then, in Ulduar, they went all out with hard modes, where 10 of the 14 bosses had hard mode triggers. And if you defeated all of the bosses on their hard modes, you were rewarded with being able to fight a hard mode only boss, who you could only attempt for 1 hour each week after pulling him. The first of the bosses was the Flame Leviathan, who had a hard mode trigger similar to Sartharion, where there was 4 towers in the room that would give the boss a buff if they were left alive. So in order to activate the hard mode, all you had to do was not kill the towers before killing the boss, and you could get various levels of gear depending on how many towers you left alive, with the hardest one being leaving all 4 of them alive. The next boss, XT2 Deconstructor, whose hard mode trigger was destroying his heart that he exposed at intervals throughout the fight. Destroying the heart would heal him to full health, give him a massive health increase on top of that, and give him a damage boost. Now, normally you would want to DPS the heart when it becomes active, because it takes double damage, and the damage is transferred over to the boss. So you'd want to put in as much damage as possible into the heart without destroying it, unless you wanted to trigger the hard mode. The assembly of Iron Boss is pretty similar to the Bug Trial, where it's a 3-boss encounter, and the hard mode is determined by which of the 3 you killed last, with killing Steelbreaker last being the hardest. Though doing it on the medium difficulty and killing Runemaster last will still allow you to activate Algalon, the hard mode boss. The boss Hodir was a simple DPS race and one of the hardest of all of the hard modes, as what you had to do was kill the boss in less than 2 minutes. Now, this hard mode was kind of impossible to accomplish, as 2 minutes was way too tough of a requirement, and the only people who actually managed to get the kill on its hard mode were the people who pulled the 4 Swarmer adds from the Freya room into this room. That way their mages could spell still their Pollinate buff, which increased the damage they did by like 25% for 30 seconds. Eventually, Blizzard changed the buff to no longer be spell stealable, and then increased the amount of time for the hard mode to 3 minutes, which players were actually able to do, but was still difficult. The hard mode for Thorm was to reach him through his little gauntlet in less than 3 minutes. That way his partner Sif would not despawn and assist him with the fight, which meant Thorm also dealt more damage and had higher health, since he would normally have a debuff cast on him when you engaged him in normal mode. The boss Freya had a hard mode similar to Sartharion as well, where she was located in the big room that had 3 mini-boss ancients that you needed to kill. Leaving all 3 of the ancients alive was the hardest way to accomplish the fight, though there was achievements for completing it with 1 to 3 of them alive, with the easiest mode being killing all 3 of them before engaging the boss. Mimiron's hard mode was probably one of the hardest ones, after pre-nerf Hodir, and was the most similar to modern-day Mythic mode, where in order to activate Mimiron's hard mode, all you had to do was push the big red button in his room before pulling the boss. This would give the boss a 10-minute enrage timer, increase the damage and health of all the vehicles by 25%, and cause fire to spawn periodically throughout the fight. And this firefighter mode is kind of infamous for being super hard, while also not being unfairly hard like Hodir was. The hard mode for General Vezax was to not make use of his Serenite Vapors mechanic, which was the only way for healers to get mana during the fight, as the encounter had this unique design where healers could not regen mana normally. Once the boss spawned 8 Serenite Vapors, they would all combine together into a mini-boss, which would also put up an invulnerable shield on General Vezax. So simply killing the mini-boss and then defeating the main boss afterwards were the requirements for completing this hard mode trigger. And then the final boss, Yogg-Saron, had 4 different hard modes, determined by how many keepers you had assisting him throughout the fight. The fight itself was super hard and had lots of mechanics that could wipe the group, so the 4 keepers in the room would provide you raid buffs that almost seemed crucial to actually completing the fight, to the point where completing it with none of the keepers up was also one of the hardest fights in the game's history. So it was a super hard mode, and very appropriate for the final boss of the raid, which was chock full of hard mode bosses. And the boss Algalon the Observer was the reward for defeating all the bosses on their hard modes. But he himself did not have a hard mode, like I mentioned earlier. You just only had 1 hour to fight him before he despawned, which I guess was his hard mode. You had to beat him in time. Old War, with all of its hard modes, was a complete success, and it is highly regarded as one of the best raids of all time. And it can owe a lot of its success to the fact that it had all these hard modes in it. It was a new and unique thing, and players liked being able to challenge themselves after they defeated on their normal difficulty. And it also made defeating the same boss more fun, as it basically forced you to do it in a way that wasn't optimal in order to get the best gear. And because Old War was such a success, they decided to incorporate hard modes into the game itself in a way, as in the very next raid, they added in the very first heroic mode raids. You see, heroic mode was a thing introduced in the Burning Crusade, as the dungeons all had heroic modes which could only be completed by max level players, after completing a small attunement which gave you a key to that heroic mode. And this was an attempt to allow players to run more than 1 or 2 dungeons at max level for loot to prepare themselves for raid, and also gave them a great place to add their endgame currency, which could be used to buy raid level gear from a vendor. So completing heroic dungeons could eventually give you an upgraded piece of loot because you got a little bit of the endgame currency every time you completed one. And players liked heroic dungeons, so they were obviously ported over to Wrath of the Lich King as well. And they were made a little bit easier to run, as all you had to do was be max level without having to complete any kind of attunement. But raids did not have a heroic mode yet. Raids themselves were already max level only. So there wasn't really a need for heroic mode in the same way they existed for dungeons, as a lot of the dungeons were balanced around non-max level or optimized characters. So the heroic modes were basically there to allow players to actually do the dungeons at max level with appropriate level gear. But raids are always set for max level players and provided max level appropriate gear. So the only way to upgrade a raid was just to run the newest and best raid that was released. The idea of running the same raid over and over on just a harder difficulty wasn't really a thing, but since players loved doing that in Old War with all of its unique hard modes, they decided to just go crazy with it in the next raid to Trial of the Crusader. TOC had 4 difficulties. Each one of these difficulties had a completely different lockout from the other 3. So, you could complete it on 10-player normal or heroic, and then 25-man normal and then heroic. And each one of these modes gave gear appropriate to its level of difficulty, with 25-man giving better gear, because that was determined to be harder to accomplish than 10-man, so heroic 10-man gear was about the same level as normal 25-man, with heroic 25-man being the best possible gear you can get from that raid instance. But since the raid had 4 separate lockouts, players would just run all 4 difficulties every week, which really burnt people out and caused people to not really like this new heroic system very much for raids. TOC also had a different heroic mode system than what we know of today. The model they used for heroic raids was basically Firefighter from Mimron. Activating hard mode just made the fight harder by giving the boss more damage and health, and might add 1 or 2 new mechanics. Basically, Firefighter Mimron is the de facto thing for all of the future heroic modes. But also in this early version, heroic modes had a limited amount of attempts, where you were given a timer of 50 attempts for the entire raid in heroic, which was shared between all 5 of the bosses. So you only had 50 tries to complete the entire place, before you were locked out of trying the place again for the rest of the week. In the next raid, Icecrown Citadel, Blizzard changed heroic modes again, where 10 and 25-man still had separate lockouts, but the normal and heroic modes shared the same lockout. So you could only run ICC 2 times per week, instead of 4 times like with TOC. And you could simply swap between heroic and normal phase during each boss, if you had heroic unlocked anyway, which would unlock after completing the place on its normal difficulty once. And limited attempts returned for the final bosses. The entire raid was not released at once, as they released different wings periodically over time. And when the first wing was released, players only had 10 attempts to down Professor Putricide. Then, when the Blood Quarter was released, this shared attempts was increased to 15. And then they only had 15 attempts to down both Professor Putricide and the Blood Queen Lenethel. And then when the Frostwing was released in the Lich King, it was increased again. Blizzard liked this limited attempt system, as they thought it would force players to have more quality attempts, instead of just bum rushing the boss until eventually they got a kill and got lucky. Although what this actually did was just encourage players to gear up a whole bunch of alts so they could have practice attempts, and then hop on their mains for their real attempts, which just made hardcore raiding even more difficult to micromanage. So they largely got rid of the attempt systems after Wrath of the Lich King, but it did return for one boss in Mists of Pandaria, as the heroic-only boss Rawden has 30 attempts per week, and still has those 30 attempts per week to this day. Blizzard justified this in an interview by saying they wanted Rawden to be a limited duration optional boss like Algalon from Old War, but that limited to 1 hour was too restrictive and unfair, in case there was a DC or server problems or IRL troubles, etc., etc. Basically, with limited attempts, they had all week to try instead of a 1 small hour window, where it was still technically a short duration boss, as you could easily get those 30 attempts done in about an hour, maybe a lot more than that. Then in Cataclysm, Blizzard made 10 and 25-man modes share lockouts as well, so you can no longer run the place 2 times each week, and they would both just drop the same level of gear, rather than 25-man mode having better gear. The only difference between the two was that the 25-man version would just drop more gear than normal. The last raid tier in Cataclysm is also when LFR mode was added to the game, and had all kinds of problems with its first iteration, like allowing players to endlessly farm tier set bonuses because they could just trade them between players, even if they've already looted them for that week. In Mists of Pandaria, they kept the system the same, but they did include one last hard mode trigger. In the Terrans of Endless Spring, the first raid fight against the Protectors of the Endless was another 3-boss encounter which awarded better gear depending on which of the 3 bosses you killed last, similar to the Bug Trio again. And this was the last time a hard mode trigger appeared in a raid. But not in dungeons, as we've had hard mode triggers as recent as Mechagon in the Mega Dungeon, which awards a special amount if you complete some of the bosses in a more difficult manner. But as far as raids go, the Terrans of Endless Spring is the last of the hard mode triggers we've had so far. At the end of Mists of Pandaria, they introduced this new mode called Flex Raiding, which was an easier mode than normal, but harder than LFR, which allowed players to do the raid with 10 to 30 people, as the boss's health and damage would just adjust based on how many people you had in the raid. And people weren't very happy with having 4 difficulties, each one of them with their own separate raid lockouts, as it was kind of like TOC all over again. So in Warlords of Draenor, they just kind of renamed everything and set a standard for the hardest difficulty. Flex mode was renamed to normal mode, and the old normal mode was renamed to heroic, and the old heroic was renamed to mythic. LFR was left the same. And then they made changes to normal heroic, where they were both given the flex system, where you can complete it with 10 to 30 people, and mythic mode was changed to 20 man only, down from 25, and made it so the hardest possible difficulty in the game could only be accomplished in a group of 20 people exactly. And this system of flex rating being incorporated into 2 modes that the average WoW players play the most is still how the raids work to this day. This last change to all the difficulties kind of worked out pretty well, and solved a whole bunch of problems that the previous 10 and 25 man modes used to have, where it was difficult to maintain a consistent roster when you needed a specific amount of people for the average player. And since a vast majority of players who actually raid don't even participate in mythic mode, it was actually a pretty nice welcome change of pace, with the biggest downside to it being that every time a new raid tier is released, we get 4 new levels of gear instead of 2 like in the past. So, gear inflation happens at a much faster rate than it used to in the early days of WoW, where equipment from the first raid tier is completely garbage by the time the last raid tier of an expansion comes out, which was not the case pre-Mists of Pandaria. So, why did Blizzard stop making hard mode triggers for raids? Well, in an interview, one of the developers actually answered this question, and to summarize their talking points, basically, it came down to the fact that it would be too difficult to constantly come up with new ways to initiate hard mode triggers, as it would make the fights feel too much of the same. Now, considering after reading through this list, they reused the Bug Trio hard mode 3 times. And there's actually a couple of other repeats of hard modes. This should show you something about how they kind of already ran out of ideas even during their golden age of hard mode triggers. How many different ways can you really have a boss that just lets you push a big button to increase the damage and health of everything? And why would you need that when higher levels of difficulty already exist anyway? Heroic mode has higher damage and health than normal, and some of the fights even have added mechanics, whereas mythic mode goes even further beyond. It is almost assured to have different or more mechanics than heroic mode. The current system of harder difficulties already accomplishes what hard mode triggers were trying to do, and they kind of just existed in the time period before mythic mode could add a 4th secret phase to a fight. Because mythic mode can actually accomplish more than hard mode triggers ever could, they're not really needed anymore. But they are fun, and the least they could do is add them back whenever there's council-like bosses, where killing them in the hardest order gives you a little bit better gear than normal, as there's always a council-like boss in pretty much every raid. Here's a few things about how mounts used to work in their first forms. Each race got to ride their own racial mount, and had to buy special training to ride those mounts. Like dwarves needed to learn ram riding to ride ram mounts, or orcs needing wolf riding to ride wolves.
You could then purchase riding of other racial mounts if you managed to get exalted reputations with those other races in patch 1.2. The original levels for mounts were level 40 for the 60% mount and level 60 for the epic mounts, or the 100% speed mounts. When you bought a mount, you could use it as long as you were high enough level, and you used the mount from your bags. Mounts required a 3-second cast time to mount up, and dismounted you if you entered combat or touched water. Also, the mounts themselves were expensive. Being able to actually buy the mounts at level, if it was your first character and not an alt, was pretty rare. The level 40 60% speed mount costed 100 gold, and the level 60 100% speed mount costed 1,000 gold. To adjust for inflation, getting 1,000 gold in vanilla WoW was almost like farming 500,000 gold in Legion, if you were to compare the amount of time and effort it took to get that much gold to today. It was pretty common for people to just not be able to afford one. In patch 1.4, Blizzard released the epic armor versions of the mounts we have today as the level 60 mounts for each race. It used to be that the 100% speed mounts looked exactly the same as the 60% speed mounts, only with different color variations. With this patch, those color variations were removed from the game, making those different color mounts extremely rare, as this was still pretty early on in vanilla WoW, and most people couldn't afford one yet. And to make them even more rare, Blizzard added an option to trade in one of your old color variation mounts for one of the newer armored ones. Most people can play WoW for years and never run across one of these alt color variations. I should also probably mention Warlock and Paladin mounts before I move on from this time period. Warlock and Pallies technically got a, quote, free mount at level 40, and Pallies again at 60, except for the fact that each mount required very long questions to complete, with some of them requiring you to pay a ton of gold anyway for special items for those quests. Then towards the very end of vanilla WoW, Blizzard made some big changes to mounts. First, they added the secondary profession of riding that we have today, and got rid of learning how to ride specific mounts. So at level 40, you could learn a riding skill of 75 to ride 60% speed mounts, and then at level 60, you could learn up to level 150 skill to ride 100% speed mounts. The cost of learning these two skills was about 80 gold for the 60% mounts, and around 900 gold for the epic mounts. But the cost of mounts themselves were significantly reduced. 60% mounts only cost 20 gold each instead of 100, and 100% speed mounts only cost 100 gold each instead of 1,000. This meant people could, realistically, actually buy more than one epic mount. Of course, these changes were made to ready the playing field for when flying mounts were added. In the Burning Crusade, WoW's first expansion, flying mounts were added to the game, but with the limit of only being usable in Outlands. Flying mounts could be learned at level 70, but cost 900 gold to learn, and the basic flying mounts went for 100 gold on top of that. Also, the original flying mounts at this first level only went at 60% movement speed, and were very slow. But of course, everyone saved up to get one as soon as they could, because even at such a slow flying speed, flying over things was still faster than traveling by land. And you also didn't have to worry about being dismounted by combat, or getting ganked on PvP servers. If you wanted epic flying mounts, or the 280% speed mounts, you were going to have to pay 5,000 gold for the training, and another 200 gold for the basic epic flying mount. 5,000 gold in TBC was pretty much the same as 1,000 gold in vanilla WoW, if you account for inflation. So it was hard to get, and many people saved up for months to afford it. But it was totally worth it. 280% flying was a tiny bit faster than 60%. I should probably also mention, in this time mounts still only had one speed to them. If you bought a 60% flying mount, it could only ever fly at 60% speed, even if you had 280 speed training. Same with ground mounts and their speeds. Of course, if you were a PvPer and reached the gladiator rank in arenas, part of your rewards was an exclusive 280% speed flying mount, and a free skill up to ride that mount. so really good PvPers didn't have to pay 5,000 gold to ride epic flying mounts, which was probably a pretty good incentive to get people to actually PvP. A problem WoW currently has, where arena participation is at an all-time low. Also with the Burning Crusade, Blizzard introduced the first ever profession mounts, with the 2 flying machines engineers could make. But only engineers could use these mounts, so obviously, many people took engineering just to use them, even if engineering wasn't one of the greatest professions to have at the time. You really shouldn't underestimate just how much people really love mounts. Ground mounts also saw some adjustments. The 60% ground mounts were changed to be learned at level 30 instead of 40. The training cost was reduced to 35 gold, making it a lot more noob-friendly to actually have a mount while leveling up for the first time. And the 100% speed mounts were changed to only cost 600 gold instead of 900 to learn the riding skill. Still kinda expensive. In Wrath of the Lich King, Blizzard added the first of many to-come restrictions to flying in New Worlds. In order to prevent people from flying around Northrend, they added the clause of needing cold weather flying to fly in Northrend, which cost 1,000 gold to learn at 77. The reason it was learned at a lower than max level is because the last 2 zones you could level in, Ice Crown and Storm Peaks, were designed with flying in mind. Hell, one of the main quest hubs in Ice Crown is your faction's flying ship that is constantly in the air. Blizzard also added 310 flying speed mounts in this expansion, only with the twist of there being no way to actually train to use it. Only special mounts from hard to get raiding and PvP achievements had the 310% movement speed, so the only way to fly at the fastest possible speed was to be a hardcore raider, PvPer, or to wait a year, because this is also the expansion Blizzard added achievements, and with achievements, the holiday meta achievement of what a long strange trip it's been, which required you to complete pretty much all of the holiday achievements of every single major holiday event in game, which in the end awarded a 310 flying speed mount, and this mount is how most of the player base actually managed to get 310 flying. Just like in TBC, Blizzard made some changes to ground mounts again. This time, the changes were a lot bigger, and are pretty much still how mounts function today. Mounts were changed to only require a 1.5 second cast time, instead of 3 seconds, cutting the mount cast time in half. 60% speed mounts could be learned at level 20, and only for 4 gold. That's a huge discount compared to the old vanilla version of level 40 and 100 gold. The 100% speed mounts were lowered to be learned at level 40 and only cost 50 gold to learn. The basic flying mount was changed to be learned at level 60. Its base movement speed was increased to 150% movement speed, because 60% was kinda stupid for a flying mount, and its cost was reduced to 250 gold, down from 900. With this change, players could actually fly the whole time they quested through Outlands now, assuming they had the gold to afford the flying. And they also added a Tome of Cold Weather Flight, which was an heirloom that could be bought by max level players to teach an alt how to fly in Northrend, allowing players to fly the whole time they could quest in Northrend, instead of just the tail end of it. On an alt anyway. Wrath of the Lich King was the mount-friendly expansion, paving way for all of the conveniences we enjoy today when it comes to mounts. This expansion is also when the Mount tab was added, so you no longer had to carry around mounts in your bags to use them. Also, side note, the patch most of these changes went live, patch 3.2, is also when I started playing the game. I remember downloading the game and messing around in my Torrent Hunter, logging off and going to school, only to come back and see that I had to download this thing called a patch if I wanted to play. I thought maybe something had gone wrong and they were trying to fix my game, since I had just installed it. And I remember reading through the patch notes and seeing the mount changes and thinking, wow, that's neat. I'm glad I started playing now because I can get a mount when I hit level 20. Also side note, mammoth mounts introduced in this expansion actually had their own health pools, and you could jump from high places and they would just take the fall damage for you and die, as well as allowing players to carry around other people on their mounts for the first time. Anyways, back to the main video topic. Wrath was also when the very first ever store mount was added to the game, the Celestial Steed. Now, store mounts are a pretty accepted part of the game nowadays, and most people don't really bat an eye at them when a new one is announced. But this mount was different. You see, this mount actually provided a tiny in-game advantage. It used to be that all mounts were character specific and not account-wide. If you got an awesome mount from an achievement on your main, you couldn't use it on your alt, even if you had the correct level of riding and etc. But the sparkly pony would be mailed to every single character you had, including all future characters you might make. I still have the sparkle pony in the bags of some of my alts that I made back then that never hit level 20 to use it. And what this meant was that you only needed to pay the 4 gold for training to be able to use a mount, instead of also having to have like 20 gold to buy your first mount. Not only that, but the Sparkle Pony was the only mount in game to also scale with your riding training. It would go at 60% speed at level 20, 100% speed at level 40, 150% speed and be able to fly at level 60, and so on and so on. All other mounts only had one mode of speed, and that's it. So with all of these advantages over regular mounts, people were outraged at WoW going paid to win, and the Sparkle Pony ended up doing extremely well. Tons of people bought one. In fact, you had to wait an hour-long queues on Blizzard's store if you wanted a chance at getting one. I, of course, bought one too because of all the advantages I listed earlier. It was a very convenient mount to have, and it looked cool. The mount was so popular that if you ran a BG at low levels, chances are half the team on both sides would be riding the Sparkle Pony. If you went to a low-level questing area, half the players there would be running around on Sparkle Ponies. It was such a popular mount that Blizzard even made fun of it in their famous quests, Into the Machine, where they have a character named Johnny Awesome who's decked out in heirlooms and rides around on a Sparkle Pony, because that was the stereotypical hardcore WoW player's alt, full heirlooms and a Celestial Steed. Since the Celestial Steed was such a success, Blizzard eventually turned a lot of the things that made the mount such a good seller into other mounts as well. But we'll talk about those things a little bit later. In Cataclysm, with the revamp of the old world, flying mounts no longer had the distinction of only usable in Outlands and Northrend, and instead didn't say anything. There were still some no flying zones, but with flying enabled in Azeroth, there was no real need to make the distinction. It was just easier for a zone to tell you you couldn't fly there. Old world zone flying could be bought right away and learned at level 60. Which is the last time Blizzard allowed players to fly right off the bat in a new expansion in the new areas. Mounts were also changed to scale with your riding level, so no longer was a Celestial Steed the only mount in game who could do that. And also, Blizzard allowed players to train in 310 flying speed, which, of course, allowed you to ride whatever mount you wanted at the highest speed, instead of only the handful that could previously. If you managed to get 310 flying before the change, you got the skill up for free, instead of paying 5,000 gold for it. And cold weather flying was changed to be learned at the trainer at level 68, instead of needing to buy an heirloom tome, and its cost was cut in half to 500 gold, which just made questing through Wrath a little easier. Cataclysm is also when the first flying 2-seater craftable mount was added to the game in the form of the Sandstone Drake. Before this, the only way to get a flying 2-seater was through recruiter friend promotions. The Sandstone Drake was pretty darn expensive, as a lot of its mats could only be bought from special vendors that sold them for tens of thousands of gold. But it was still a more convenient way of flying a friend around than having to deal with recruiter friend. In Mist of Pandaria, Blizzard started to not really like flying mounts as much as they used to. So they made it so that you couldn't fly in Pandaria until max level. And even today, as of making this video in Legion, is still the case. Pandaria is one of the slowest zones to level through, as the only way to get flying early is to buy a stupid book from the black market auction house that will allow you to learn the flying at level 85. They also added a special flying skill to be able to fly cloud serpents. which they eventually just gave to everyone for free since it was a kinda dumb restriction. Mist is also when mounts were finally made account bound, and with this change, in-game store mounts no longer had any advantage over normal mounts, other than looking a lot cooler. In Warlords of Draenor, Blizzard was really happy about restricting flying, and thought to themselves, you know what, how about no flying at all in Draenor? To which everyone else replied, how about we do fly? Pretty much every discussion thread on the WoW's forums that talked about flying in Draenor would cap out. People really wanted to be able to fly in the new expansion, like they could in all other expansions. But that's not to say all of the discussion was one-sided. A lot of the people didn't want flying at all in Draenor, but these were mainly world PvPers who loved to gank people, so no one cared about them. And Blizzard eventually added a way to get flying in Draenor a few patches into the game with a Pathfinder achievement. This achievement was a very long, hard-to-accomplish list of tasks that basically proved you'd already explored and did everything in the zone and deserved flying. And people kinda liked it. Once you got the achievement once, you unlocked flying on all of your characters and alts forever, which meant you didn't have to spend money on zone-specific flying for each new alt you leveled up. And since there was such a positive reaction to the pathfinding achievement, Blizzard did the same thing for Legion and didn't allow flying on the Broken Isles until you complete the Mega achievement, which couldn't actually be completed until a few patches in when the Broken Shore content unlocked. Which was basically a half measured on Blizzard's part. They wanted people to actually explore their new zones they spent a lot of time on instead of people just flying over it, while at the same time, eventually, allowing people to fly over it. Except Argus, you can't fly there ever. Of course, the new system is not perfect. It's kinda a deterrent to players returning to the game after long breaks, or to new players, and will be a pain in the ass to get in future expansions, where you'd much rather just want to pay to unlock flying, rather than having to do literally every single quest in the zones, plus all the other tedious shit you need to do to unlock flying just because you didn't play during that expansion. Now, let me go back a little bit and talk about a few things I may have skipped over. In Warlords is when Blizzard made it so a lot of flying mounts could be used as ground mounts as well, in no-fly zones. Cold weather flying was also changed to only cost 50 gold to learn at level 68, and be given to a player for free once they hit level 80, if they hadn't bought it already before then. Warlords of Draenor is also when the very first, and only, level 1 mounts were added to the game, the heirloom motorcycles. Well, actually, I guess I should say the first mount that could be used at level 1 that functioned like a normal mount. Technically, the sea turtles came first, and also could be used at level 1, but they didn't increase your ground speed, so mounting one was the same as just running at normal speed. They did increase your swim speed, though. The motorcycles are some of the few mounts to not scale with your riding training, and only ever go at 60% movement speed. But they do have a few advantages over normal mounts. For one, you can use it without training, so it's usable at level 1, giving players a much faster questing experience than ever before. And two, you can't be dismounted from a daze on this mount, so it's actually useful for running through packs of mobs at higher levels if you don't mind the slower speed. In Legion is when Blizzard changed swimming mounts to actually swim faster than 100% movement speed. They used to be pathetically slow, and now are only less so. They should really increase it way more than it is now, but I guess it's better than the slow speed it used to be before they finally increased it a little bit in Legion. Did you know the in-game calendar wasn't added to WoW until the start of Wrath of the Lich King? Before then, if you wanted to schedule raids and events with friends or guildies, it was done by just doing it the old-fashioned way, with verbal agreements or on a guild website, or by using an add-on like Group Calendar. Group Calendar functions a lot like the calendar we have in-game by default. You can click on it in the top right-hand corner, create events, and then invite other players who also have the add-on installed to groups and raid events. Blizzard has a history for putting add-ons in-game that they like, and they thought it was probably time for them to have a default in-game calendar, so guilds could have an easier time organizing events. So then in Wrath of the Lich King, with the pre-patch, we got the calendar we have today, pretty much. Blizzard is known for not making too many changes to features once they're added. You can create events and then add people to it by typing in their names. With the correct permissions, you can mass invite people of certain ranks in your guild as well, to make scheduling a raid easier. Over time, they added stuff that would be shown to the calendar by default, like special events, holidays, battleground weekends, raid lockouts, weekly events, brawls, and micro holidays. If an event is cancelled or deleted, everyone who was invited will get a message in the mail. Deleting events that have already happened will also send messages, funny enough, and it used to be possible to accept or moderate events through the calendar with the WoW Armory. But once they revamped the Armory to what we have today, they got rid of a lot of that functionality. Especially with the removal of the Armory app, which allowed you to check your in-game calendar from your phone. For some reason, Blizzard just kind of removed all of that useful support, and we don't really know why. But with the removal of the old Armory and the Armory app, the only way to check your calendar and interact with it is to log into the game. And that is the very brief history of the in-game calendar. It was a feature that should have been in the game since the beginning, but wasn't actually added until Wrath of the Lich King. The Summoning Stone. Did you know it's actually called the Meeting Stone? I didn't actually know that until researching this video. Everyone I know has called it the Summoning Stone because, that's what it does. It summons players. But it didn't always do that, as surprising as that may sound. The Meeting Stone was first added to the game in patch 1.3. That's right, such a crucial part of running dungeons wasn't even in the game at launch. It was added later, and didn't actually work at all like it does today. You know how today if you want to run a mythic dungeon by yourself, you open the group finder tab and just look for a group or create your own? Well, that's what the Meeting Stone did, except only for that one dungeon the stone was associated to, and only connected other people using the stone as well, and was kinda Blizzard's first try at a dungeon finder tool. Except one with lots of problems. For one, like I mentioned, you can only queue for that one dungeon the stone was associated to. So if you wanted to queue up for Wailing Caverns, for example, you could run out to the Meeting Stone and queue up for that one dungeon, and maybe wait a few hours to get a group, because of 2. The stone was located in front of the dungeons in the middle of nowhere, and took you away from major cities and trade chat, where it was a lot easier and more common to find a group for a dungeon. And since most people who wanted to run dungeons would go to a city to find a group, no one was using the Meeting Stones, and with no one using the Meeting Stones, they just became even more useless with its negative feedback loop. No one used the Meeting Stones because no one else used the Meeting Stones. Also on PvP servers, Meeting Stones were just a nice place to ambush players, giving it even one more layer of inconvenience. A few patches later, Blizzard tried to make the Meeting Stones a little bit more convenient by allowing people to queue for a Meeting Stone from innkeepers who were near the dungeons, which meant you didn't have to leave the local town to queue up for a dungeon. But by this point, no one was using the Meeting Stones anyway, and this didn't really change that. People still opted in to just form groups the old-fashioned way than to queue up through the innkeepers. I can't help but feel like the Meeting Stone might have been more useful if it also teleported people to the stone after finding a group. But nope, everyone still had to run there. All it did was try and find a group for you. Although, the mechanic Meeting Stones are known for today did exist in Vanilla WoW. They were called Warlocks though. Warlocks could summon people places with their summoning portal, but it required 2 other players and soul shards. So since most people back then, like today, are too lazy to run to a raid during raid time, it was common practice for a warlock to start farming shards before the raid started to summon everyone. Then in the Burning Crusade pre-patch, Blizzard finally gave up on the old model of the stone, and basically just turned them into the warlock summoning portals we have today. Although, with limitations. You could only summon people to the stone who were within the level range of the dungeon the stone was associated to, which wasn't really a big deal for raiders or people running max level dungeons, and was more of a problem for low level players trying to summon a higher level one to help them run a dungeon. or higher level players trying to summon a lower level player for whatever reason, or during holiday events as most seasonal dungeon bosses were in low level dungeons. Sure, there were some limitations to it, but it was still miles better than it used to be, and was actually an incredibly useful feature to have now, instead of an ignored one. Of course, this limitation lasted all of 2 expansions, as at the tail end of Wrath, Blizzard removed level restrictions from stones, and instead just imposed a minimum level cap to all of them. You just have to be at least level 15 to use a stone, which is still how they work today. But even with the meeting stones actually being convenient now, there was a time in Cataclysm when they were practically never used. You see, Dungeon Finder would port you straight to the dungeon when you queued up, and since there was no mythic modes, there was no reason to ever do a dungeon without queuing up for one. And Cata is when Blizzard introduced guild perks, including the Have Group World Travel perk, which allowed one player to summon their entire raid to their location. The perk did have a long 2-hour cooldown, but with everyone in the raid being able to use their own cooldown, you only really needed one person to get to a raid to summon everyone else, and then have the other people summon the stragglers who missed the original summons or had to go back to town for whatever reason. And with these 2 things coupled together, there was really no reason to ever use a summoning stone again. And people wondered if Blizzard would make changes to the stone, or maybe just stop including them in the game altogether with future expansions. But they need not worry, as Blizzard instead just removed the guild perk, forcing people to use stones at raids, at the very least. And then in Warlords of Draenor, they added mythic dungeons, which forced people to use stones at dungeons too. And nowadays, summoning stones are used just as much as they ever were, after vanilla.
Glyphs were added to the game in Wrath of the Lich King, as a way to further customize your character to increase its power or utility. And nowadays, they are used almost exclusively for cosmetic effects. When first announced, Blizzard said there would be 3 kinds of glyphs: major, lesser, and minor. They also created the profession of inscription in order to create these glyphs, because for some of you who may not know, inscription was not one of the original professions in the game, and was in fact the last major profession Blizzard created for Wrath of the Lich King. When Wrath of the Lich King launched, they eventually removed lesser glyphs, and only had the 2 types of major and minor. Major glyphs were large improvements to your character's abilities, where they could increase the power of major spells, or give them extra effects, like adding a dot to a spell, or giving an effect a stun on top of whatever else it did. Now, minor glyphs were just cosmetic changes, or quality of life changes to certain abilities. There were definitely some useful minor glyphs, like how hunters had minor glyphs that made ticks of their men pet give your pet happiness, and another minor glyph that reduced the cooldown of feigned death, both of which were actually incredibly useful things to have. But on a whole, minor glyphs were just kind of minor changes that rarely affected combat. And in order to use glyphs, you needed to have the glyphs in your inventory, and you had to be next to a lexicon of power, which was located near scribe trainers. And using the glyphs would consume the glyph in your inventory, and if you wanted to change the glyph to something else, you had to buy another glyph and replace it. Then if you wanted to change it back, you had to buy that glyph again in order to replace it. Glyphs were basically a consumable thing that you had to buy constantly if you wanted to change them out. So most people would just find whichever glyphs were the best and just kind of use those ones for the most part. And glyphs also worked as level up incentives. As you leveled up, you got to unlock more of your glyph slots. At level 15, you got your first major and minor glyphs. At level 30, you got an extra major, and so on and so on. The glyph unlocks kind of worked like how our talent point system works today. And then this was how glyphs worked for the first expansion they were introduced. Consumable items that you could use to increase the power of your character. But Blizzard didn't really like how people had to carry around glyphs in their bags if they wanted to change specs, or alternate to PvP. So, in Cataclysm, they turned the glyphs into permanent recipe-type things that, once you learned it, you could just choose it again later on without having to buy another glyph. And I remember when this change went through, because in the Goldmaker community, this change was known as Glyphmas, because everyone was trying to buy out all the glyphs they possibly could, so they could just learn them all immediately and not ever have to buy glyphs again. This change severely limited how scribes could make money,
since glyphs were no longer consumables that needed to be bought all the time. So this is when Blizzard started giving scribes more things to focus on besides just glyphs. Also in Cataclysm, glyphs saw a few more changes. Blizzard had announced a new system called Path of the Titans, which ironically were supposed to kind of work like how Azerite traits work today, but they eventually canceled it and instead incorporated some of the ideas into the glyph system. And with this, they added a new glyph slot called Prime Glyphs. Prime Glyphs were basically what major glyphs used to be, where they were just direct improvements to your character's power in some way, shape, or form. Major Glyphs were changed to be also improvement to your character's power, but with some kind of trade-off, like Immolation Trap doing 100% more damage but having half the duration. And minor glyphs were still basically the same, just cosmetic changes. And since glyphs were permanent now, they added their first ever system of using a consumable item to change them out. And these items were called Vanishing Powder and Dust of Disappearance. This system is still kind of how we change our talent points to this day. It's just currently we use an item that then gives us 1 minute to change our talent points around. But this was like the first ever iteration of that mechanic. And with this new glyph system, they changed the level of rewards for obtaining glyphs. It used to be you unlock the glyph slots every 15 levels or so. In the new system, it was every 25 levels. So for level 25, you got 1 prime, 1 major, and 1 minor glyph slot. And then at level 50, you unlock the second row of those. And then level 75, you got the third row. It was also in this time period where players still had talent points. So it was still kind of fun to level up and get these kinds of rewards. In Mist of Pandaria, Blizzard said they didn't really like how prime glyphs turned out, and just removed them. So in Mist of Pandaria, you only had major and minor glyphs, and they still kind of worked like how they used to, in that major glyphs would give you power, but usually at some kind of cost, like how Dispriest could cast Penance while moving, but it increased the mana cost of that spell. And the level up rewards for glyphs were still the same as they were in Cataclysm, except you just didn't get the prime glyph slot anymore. Then in Warlords of Draenor, glyphs were still basically the same, except they gave you the ability to learn certain glyphs as you leveled up. Not all of them, mind you, just some of them, as kind of level up rewards. Blizzard also had been on the trend of heavily nerfing glyphs so they weren't as impactful to gameplay as they used to be. And in WoD, major glyphs were at their weakest, with some classes not even having 3 major glyphs that would give them direct damage or healing buffs. Then in Legion, after making glyphs less and less important with every new expansion, they just straight up removed the glyph interface, removed major glyphs from the game, and now only minor glyphs are available. But now, since there is no more glyph interface, you can technically have as many minor glyphs as you want. And nearly all of them are just cosmetic changes, like changing what kind of water elemental your frost mage uses. And in BFA, there wasn't really any changes to the glyphs. They still work like they did in Legion. In fact, I had to look up to see if glyphs were still in the game while I was making this video, because I couldn't remember the last time I bought or used one. So glyphs, over their history, went from an integral part of your class that directly impacted the power of your character and gave you more level up rewards, to a feature that today, many people probably have forgotten exists. Technically, cosmetic glyphs have been in the game since they were added, so glyphs in some way, shape, or form still exist, and would be more apt to say glyphs that directly increase the power of your character have been removed from the game entirely, with Blizzard's attempts to remove as many barriers to entry for raids as possible. Because if there's less ways to customize your characters, then there's less things to worry about that you have to do before you can jump into a raid. The mailbox. You might be thinking to yourself, why are you making a video about mailboxes? Are you out of ideas already? And that line of thinking comes from a player who's so used to the conveniences of today's mailboxes that they're not even worth thinking about. They're everywhere, readily available, and super convenient. What is there to even talk about? Well, quite a bit actually. First, let's talk about the location of the mailbox itself. I'll use Orgrimmar as an example because it was the major city for Horde since it's where the auction house was located. Plus I'm not 12, so I don't really play Alliance. In Vanilla WoW, Org had only 2 mailboxes. One in front of the bank, which was also close to the auction house, and another up north at the entrance to the Valley of Honor. Since the mailbox in front of the bank was in the more convenient location, it was used the most. In fact, it had such heavy traffic since it was the only nearby mailbox next to the auction house, it was always crowded. And because of the high traffic, the whole dancing on top of the mailbox or mounting up on a large mount and standing on top of it were very common things and something everyone who played the game encountered at least once, if not on a daily basis. Over time though, Blizzard added more mailboxes to Org and other major cities, and put auction houses in all major cities and connected them, heavily reducing the traffic in front of the golden mailbox. And today, well, just take a look at this screenshot of all the mailboxes in Orgrimmar today, compared to the mailboxes in vanilla. With so many mailboxes and so many places to access an auction house, I personally have one in my garrison, the heavy traffic and mailbox dancing isn't really a thing that exists anymore. It's a relic of bad city design, and probably won't ever come back unless Blizzard just decides to remove 90% of the mailboxes in the game. The Alliance equivalent to the mailbox in front of the Org Bank was an Ironforge, since the auctioneers in vanilla were an Ironforge instead of Stormwind for some reason. And then there's the mechanics of the mailboxes that have changed over time. If you send a simple message, the mail will arrive immediately and can be viewed for up to 30 days. But before early Burning Crusade, in patch 2.1.3, mail only lasted for 3 days after being read, instead of just being there for 30 days all the time like it is today. In current WoW, if you send mail to an alt, it will arrive immediately. Back in the day, it took an hour, just like mailing it to other players. In Cataclysm, Blizzard added a guild perk called Guild Mail, which allows mail to be sent immediately to other guild members, similar to mailing things to an alt. This was again another pretty convenient addition, since mailing things like mats, gems, or enchants to guildies is a common thing, and more convenient than having to meet up with them in person to trade the stuff. Also, mailboxes could collect all mail automatically, only very recently. For the longest time, you needed an add-on to hit the Collect All Mail button. Back in the day, you had to manually open each mail tab and click on all the items one by one. The amount of mail you could actually send was also more limited. Before patch 2.3, you could only send 7 items in a single message. Today, you can send up to 12, which is weird that they just didn't double it, and I don't know why 12, it's kind of arbitrary, but it is more than 7, I guess. The mailbox only shows 50 messages at a time. If you collect all 50, you have to wait 1 minute before it resets and allows you to collect more. Or you can just type in /reload to do it right away. But prior to patch 2.0.1, or the very beginning of the Burning Crusade, you would need to actually log out or talk to an auctioneer in order to collect more mail past 50. Which was a lot more inconvenient than just waiting 60 seconds. Speaking of the auction house, mail from the auction house works differently than it does for players mailing each other. Mail from the auction house is displayed last, and is not lost even when the players can't send you mail. This suggests that mail from the auction house isn't actually part of your mailbox, and is instead stored on the auction house's server when it's being opened from your mailbox. And I'm pretty sure only the auction house has special privileges with your mailbox, seeing as the mailbox is heavily involved in the use and operation of the auction house. If you win an item, or an item you listed expires, it's sent to your mailbox. If you fail to win an item, the gold is sent to your mailbox, same case for money from your own successful sales. But just like regular mail, if you don't collect the mail in 30 days, even if it's from the auction house, it will just disappear, giving the illusion that it works like regular mail. Speaking of which, there is a method you can use for storing items that really only people who heavily play the auction house even bother with. There is no known limit to how much mail can be sent to a player. So if you don't have enough space to store all your mats or just things you want to save that can be mailed to other people, you can just mail them to an alt and just not collect the mail. The mail will be sent back to you after 30 days automatically, in which case you have another 30 days to collect the items and mail them back, and repeat the process all over again. With this method, it's possible to just treat the mailbox as your unlimited space bank for almost 60 days before you have to collect and resend. Of course, the risk to doing this is if you don't collect the mail after its return, the items will disappear. So if you forget all about the stuff you mailed, you can lose all your shit. Before the tail end of Mists of Pandaria, you couldn't actually mail items to your alts on other servers. Because back in the day, you had to mail your heirlooms to your toons for them to use them, and not just create them from the heirloom tab like you can today. And leveling up on a new server was like starting over again, because not only could you not mail gold to them, which you still can't mail gold cross server today, but you also couldn't send over bind on account items. You had to get a new set of heirlooms on each new server you wanted to play on. But in patch 5.4.2, the tail end of Mists of Pandaria, they gave you the ability to mail to different servers by simply adding the name of the server after the character's name. Also, speaking of heirlooms, there were not mailboxes in all of the starting areas. You would have to run to the nearest town with an innkeeper, because that's usually where mailboxes were located in small towns, right in front of the innkeeper, in order to get all of your heirlooms. So most new characters just wouldn't use them until around level 5 when they were naturally led to their nearest mailbox. And I'm not 100% sure on this, but I believe there were some starting zones that just straight up didn't have mailboxes at all. And they couldn't see their first mailbox until like level 10 when they got out of their starting zone. And to end off this video, I'll give you some fun facts about mailboxes. There are 3 ways to summon a mailbox out in the world wherever you want. With the Moly device engineers can make, the Gummy device from the level 2 engineer's workshop in your garrison, and with the Argent Squire upgraded with the Argent Pony Brittle. Both the Moly and Gummy can be used by anyone once it's laid out, but the Argent Squire can only be used by the person who summons it to collect mail. In the Warcraft comics Legends Volume 1, there's a short story called How to Win Friends, with a scene of a dwarvish bar and a mishmash of conversations, where one of the dwarves says, "dancing on the mailbox right there in town square," which is an obvious reference to the infamous mailbox dancers I mentioned earlier on in this video, which kinda makes mailbox dancers canon in lore.